A single radar blip flickered on the screen, and the tide of the Pacific turned forever. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a naval clash, it was a gamble of fate, steel, and skies. 4 Japanese carriers, 3 American, thousands of miles from land, locked in a battle that would decide the war's direction. Dive bombers screamed through smoke-filled skies. Ships vanished in fire. Pilots vanished into waves, and in just days, an empire's unstoppable advance came undone. Tonight, drift into the turning point of World War II, told softly, completely, and without interruption, as engines roar, decks burn, and destiny unfolds over open ocean. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Your presence keeps memory alive across the quiet waters of night. Shadows over Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The morning began like any other on the island of Oahu. Warm sunlight, still waters, sailors laughing over breakfast, and a quiet sky. But that calm was an illusion because, in a matter of minutes, the sky would crack open, fire would rain from above, and the United States Pacific Fleet, proud and powerful, would be reduced to smoldering wreckage. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor. No warning, no declaration, just chaos. The sound of machine gun fire echoed across the harbor. Bombs whistled through the air. Battleships, once symbols of American might, were shattered in place. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. Her forward magazines, massive storage rooms filled with explosive shells, detonated in an instant. The blast tore through the hull, split steel like paper, and killed over 1,100 men in seconds. Many never had time to reach the deck. Others were trapped below as the ship sank in flames. The explosion was so violent it lifted the Arizona from the water before slamming her back down, broken and burning. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma rolled over and capsized. Sailors clawed at the hull from the inside, banging on steel, screaming for help as the ship slowly turned belly up. The rescue crews could hear them, but they couldn't get through fast enough. Smoke blanketed the harbor. Oil burned on the water's surface. Sailors leapt from decks into flaming seas. Some swam through patches of fire to survive. Others never surfaced again. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Over 1,000 more were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft lay in ruins. It wasn't just an attack, it was humiliation. A sucker punch to the gut of a nation that hadn't even declared war. The Japanese had planned it down to the minute. 6 aircraft carriers, over 300 planes. They launched from far out at sea, cloaked by distance and timing. The surprise was total, the damage incalculable. In Washington, the news landed like a thunderclap. President Franklin Roosevelt, known for his measured tone, addressed the nation the next day. His voice, calm but firm, called it what it was, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war within hours. The United States was now fully in World War II. But the cost of that awakening had already been paid in blood. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was supposed to be the beginning of the end for American naval power in the Pacific. With the fleet crippled, their path across the ocean seemed wide open. And for a time, it was. In the months that followed, Japan struck like lightning. The Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, Wake Island. One by one, American outposts and Allied strongholds fell. The Japanese empire expanded like wildfire, fast, ruthless, and seemingly unstoppable. The psychological toll was immense. The American public, stunned by Pearl Harbor, now watched as news of defeat followed news of defeat. The enemy was advancing. The Pacific was shrinking. And worse, the heart of the U.S. Navy, its battleships, was gone. But there was something the Japanese hadn't destroyed. The American aircraft carriers, those floating air bases that could strike from hundreds of miles away, were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga had been out at sea. Pure luck or fate. In their absence, those carriers would become the centerpiece of a new kind of naval war. One fought not by massive battleships lining up for direct fire, but by planes launched from over the horizon, a war of mobility, of timing, of intelligence. And in the shadows of the devastation, some were already preparing for that next chapter. One of them was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. In late December, just 3 weeks after the attack, he took command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He walked aboard the USS Grayling in Pearl Harbor, saluted the flag flying above a graveyard of ships, and began rebuilding a navy from the ashes. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he listened, he studied, and above all, he believed the United States could strike back. He knew it would take time, luck, and sacrifice. But Nimitz also knew something else. Japan had made a critical mistake. By striking first and striking so hard, they had awakened a giant. And now that giant was learning, adapting, watching. And somewhere beneath the pain and smoke and fury, something else was happening. American codebreakers, men working in small, unmarked rooms, were picking apart Japan's radio messages. They couldn't see the enemy ships, but they could hear them. And that sound would soon lead to something far bigger than revenge. It would lead to Midway. But at the start, that seemed impossible. How do you fight a navy you can't see? How do you strike when you're outnumbered? When your enemies have momentum, confidence, and command of the skies? The answers were still unclear. But what was clear was that Pearl Harbor had changed everything. The Pacific was now a battlefield, and every ship, every plane, every decision would carry the weight of that morning in December. On the ocean floor, the wreckage of the USS Arizona still bled oil. Even now, long after the flames had died, the sea held her grief. Families waited for news that would never come. Mothers clutched telegrams. Wives packed away uniforms. Children asked questions that fathers would never answer. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military failure. It was a national trauma. It left a scar, but it also carved out a purpose. And that purpose was clear: never again. Admirals, pilots, sailors, engineers, they all felt it. Not in words, but in the quiet, heavy silence of what had been lost. And in that silence, plans were already forming, plans to strike back. Yet even then, few could imagine what was coming. That within 6 months, the United States would face the same navy that had shattered Pearl Harbor. And not just survive the encounter, but win. Not with more ships, not with superior numbers, but with broken codes, brave pilots, and a moment of timing so perfect it would rewrite the war. But before that could happen, they had to understand the enemy, follow his moves, predict his intentions. And in a room in Hawaii, one man was starting to do exactly that. He didn't wear medals. He didn't command fleets. But what he was about to uncover would change the fate of the Pacific. His name was Joseph Rochefort, and he was listening. Midway was still months away, but the clock had already started, and the next move belonged to the shadows. Smoke still hung over the shattered hulls of American battleships in Pearl Harbor when a new storm began to take shape. One not of steel and fire, but of strategy and shadows. The man at its center wasn't loud or boastful or bloodthirsty. He was quiet, precise, a chess master in a world drunk on war. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and he had a plan that would shape the fate of the Pacific. But before his fleet ever moved, before a single torpedo was primed, Yamamoto saw something few others did. He had studied in the United States. He knew its people, their resolve, their industry, their limitless resources, and above all, their capacity for vengeance. That's what terrified him. And that's why he believed Pearl Harbor hadn't ended a war. It had only awakened a giant. Yamamoto wasn't just an admiral. He was the admiral, the architect behind Japan's greatest victories and its most dangerous gambles. He didn't rise through the ranks by sheer ambition. He rose through insight and foresight. While others saw glory in conquest, he saw cracks forming beneath the empire's feet. Time, he believed, was not on Japan's side. By the winter of 1942, Yamamoto knew the clock was ticking. The United States, though wounded, was already recovering. Shipyards buzzed like hives. Pilots were being trained by the thousands. Factories once churning out cars now fed the war machine. Soon, America's navy would be bigger than ever, stronger, angrier. And when that tide came crashing down, Japan's fragile gains would vanish like mist. He had to act, and fast. But a simple battle wouldn't be enough. Yamamoto wanted annihilation, not just a strike against American ships, but a death blow to American morale. The heart of the Pacific Fleet had to be carved out, and it had to happen before the US could regain its footing. It had to be decisive, spectacular, unforgettable. And so he turned to Midway. Midway Atoll, a dot in the ocean, barely visible on a map. But in Yamamoto's eyes, it was the perfect trap. Far enough west to draw the Americans out, close enough to supply his carriers. The idea was bold. Send a powerful force toward Midway, make it look like Japan was planning a full invasion, and wait for the US fleet to respond. Once they took the bait, Yamamoto's ships would pounce from the shadows, surround them, sink them, and win the war in a single elegant stroke. It was a gamble built on precision, on deception, on timing so tight even a few hours could unravel everything. Yamamoto knew the Americans would fight for Midway. It was too close to Hawaii, too symbolic, and most of all, it was a stepping stone. If Japan took Midway, they could threaten Pearl Harbor again. They could even strike the US mainland. The Americans had to defend it. Yamamoto would make sure of that. But there was a catch. To make the plan work, Yamamoto needed secrecy. Absolute secrecy. Not just about the target, but the very movement of his fleets. The Japanese Navy would fan out across thousands of miles with aircraft carriers leading the charge, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Meanwhile, a second force would pretend to attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing attention northward. It was a sprawling, complex operation, one that required flawless coordination across the vast blue wilderness of the Pacific. If even one part slipped out of place, it could all collapse. Yamamoto trusted in Japanese code systems, in radio silence, in the discipline of his sailors. He believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor, that their morale was shaken, that their intelligence was blind. But in a small, windowless room on the island of Oahu, someone was listening. Even as Yamamoto's ships slipped away from Japanese harbors under the cover of darkness, a quiet battle was unfolding inside the cryptographic heart of the Pacific. At a place called Station Hypo, American codebreakers had been working day and night to decipher Japanese naval communications. And slowly, painfully, a name kept appearing. AF. No one knew exactly what it meant, but Commander Joseph Rochefort had a gut feeling. It meant Midway. He proposed a simple, brilliant ruse: send an uncoded message from Midway about a water shortage. If Japanese intercepts later referenced water problems at AF, then it was proof. Proof that Midway was the next target. And the trap worked. The Japanese bit. Their response came quickly. AF is short on water. That was it. All the confirmation the Americans needed. And just like that, Yamamoto's great deception, his masterstroke, was pierced. The Americans knew what was coming, and they were going to be ready. But Yamamoto had no idea. To him, the pieces were still in place. He believed surprise was on his side. He believed the Americans would walk blindly into his net, and he believed, as the date of battle neared, that victory would be swift and total. He studied his carrier commanders with pride, men like Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike. Their aircraft were seasoned, their tactics refined, morale was high. Japanese pilots trained in fierce discipline and drilled to near perfection believed themselves unbeatable. And for good reason. They had won every battle since Pearl Harbor. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. But Yamamoto worried not about his men, not about their skill, but about fate. He once wrote to a colleague, "In the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." It was not humility. It was a prediction. And it was already coming true. Because while Japan was still riding the high of conquest, America was transforming. Factories were running 24 hours a day. Liberty ships were rolling off assembly lines. New aircraft carriers were being completed in months. American industrial might, the sleeping giant Yamamoto feared, was stirring to life. Time was no longer on his side. He also knew that Japanese logistics was stretched thin. Fuel was running low. Experienced pilots couldn't be replaced fast enough. Every battle, every mission, was eroding Japan's strength, not just in ships, but in blood. But there was no turning back. Midway had already been set in motion. Carriers were steaming toward their positions. Bombers were being armed, codebooks distributed, and Yamamoto, the master planner, was watching the pieces fall into place, unaware that a mirror image was forming across the Pacific. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz was moving carriers into position. The Yorktown, damaged but not destroyed at the Coral Sea, was patched up in just 3 days and sent back into the fight. Alongside her, the Enterprise and Hornet. 3 American carriers versus 4 Japanese. It was a mismatch on paper, but it wasn't paper that decided battles. It was resolve, courage, timing, and fate. As Yamamoto finalized his orders, somewhere far ahead of him, American pilots were strapping into their cockpits. Mechanics were fueling planes under the glow of red battle lamps. Crews aboard Midway were digging in, building sandbag walls, checking anti-aircraft guns, writing final letters. And in the middle of the Pacific, under skies so wide they could swallow fleets whole, 2 navies were now drifting toward the same point. They couldn't see each other yet, but they would soon. And when they did, the fate of the Pacific would no longer rest in strategy, but in fire. Because Yamamoto's perfect plan, his bold gamble, his elegant trap, was about to be sprung, but not in the way he imagined. A black pillar of smoke ascended from the twisted wreckage of what had been a warship. The air was thick with the taste of oil and salt, heavy as grief. In the early hours of December 8, 1941, the Pacific had transformed into a graveyard. Pearl Harbor was still burning, yet a new horror was already underway. Wake Island, a lonely, wind-battered atoll barely known to the American people, was under attack. Japanese bombers streaked across the sky like raptors. The men stationed there, 189 Marines, supported by civilian contractors and a few quickly trained pilots, fought back with all they had. And for a brief, fleeting moment, they held their ground. But this was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger plan, an empire-wide wave designed to engulf the Pacific. From the first moments after Pearl Harbor, Japan moved with astonishing speed. Their goal was clear: to seize the entire Pacific while America was still in shock, before the industrial power of Detroit could start producing bombers, before the young men of Iowa and Georgia could be drafted and trained, before Washington could turn its shock into a coherent strategy. In Southeast Asia, the Philippines became the next open wound. On the island of Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur, a decorated, charismatic, and intensely proud commander, watched in helplessness as his airfields were engulfed in flames. Despite the warnings, his planes had not been relocated. Almost every American bomber was destroyed on the ground, their silver fuselages twisted like foil in the intense heat. Japanese forces landed shortly after with a surgical precision. They arrived not with overwhelming force alone, but with strategic cunning. They bypassed the strongholds, attacking where the defenses were weakest. Their aircraft dominated the skies, their tanks advanced across the open plains, and their soldiers, hardened by years of brutal combat in China, moved like specters through the jungles. MacArthur's men, a mix of Filipino regulars and American volunteers, fought with courage, but they were ill-equipped, ill-trained, and outnumbered. Forced to fall back, they retreated toward Bataan and Corregidor, digging in for what would be a long and agonizing siege. Thousands of miles away, in the humid jungles of British Malaya, another front was collapsing. The British, secure in their colonial dominance, had developed Singapore into the ultimate fortress. Naval cannons were pointed out to sea, based on the assumption that no enemy would dare to attack from the land. But the Japanese did. They advanced through Thailand on bicycles, cutting through rubber plantations, roads, and British arrogance with a ruthless efficiency. In just 70 days, the supposedly invulnerable fortress of Singapore fell. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Over 80,000 soldiers, Australian, Indian and British, were taken into captivity. Churchill would later call it the worst disaster ever to befall British arms. And for Japan, it was a moment of triumph. The rising sun now shone over most of Southeast Asia. In the Pacific, Guam was conquered. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Thailand, pressured by diplomacy and threats, joined the Japanese cause. Burma was on the verge of collapse. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber, became the next objective, and the Japanese Navy moved in with overwhelming force. Everywhere, the same sequence of events occurred: a precise aerial strike, lightning-fast landings, and a quick consolidation of power. Japan was not just winning, it was dominating. Its Zero fighters outclassed the American aircraft. Its battleships moved with confidence. Its soldiers believed they were fulfilling the will of the emperor himself. And still, Wake Island held on. For 15 days, the garrison resisted. They sank ships, they shot down bombers, and they became heroes on the front pages of American newspapers. But by December 23, it was finished. Reinforcements had not arrived. Supplies were exhausted. The Japanese came back, this time with a larger fleet, and the defenders were crushed. The survivors were captured. Some were executed without a trial, others were sent to forced labor camps. Their names were lost in the noise of the war, but their defiance lit a small candle of hope in a nation engulfed in darkness. Across the Pacific, American forces were beaten and broken. The idea of a quick counter-offensive was gone. In its place was a grim reality: this was going to be a long, brutal conflict. On Bataan, the situation grew worse. Food was scarce, and disease was rampant. Malaria and dysentery were as deadly as bullets. Soldiers were boiling shoe leather for soup. Ammunition was in short supply. Air support was non-existent. The Japanese were advancing slowly but surely. The Americans and Filipinos were digging trenches and praying. And yet, Washington could offer little help. The Navy was in shambles. The Pacific Fleet's battleships were at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Only the aircraft carriers had managed to escape, and they were now the fragile core of U.S. strategy. President Roosevelt called on America to unite, but victory was still a distant hope. Factories in the Midwest were being converted. Car plants were becoming tank plants. Typewriter companies were now making rifles. But it would take time that America did not have. The Japanese, in the meantime, were moving on to their next target: Rabaul, New Britain, the Solomon Islands. Fortress after fortress, outpost after outpost, they all fell. The Pacific seemed to be a map drawn in red ink. And in every new territory, Japan was planting its flag with a ceremonial precision. At home, American mothers were staring at telegrams. Sons were missing, husbands were captured, names were being read out on the radio with a cold finality. Small towns were holding their breath. Big cities were putting up war bonds posters. Newspapers were offering maps and patriotic slogans. But behind it all, the grief was real. Yet in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was still uneasy. His bold plan had worked. His vision of a first strike to shatter America's will was coming to fruition. But he knew this was not the end. He knew America. He had studied there. He had seen its factories, its determination, its endless supply of manpower. He was afraid of what would happen when those factories were fully operational. He knew that a victory in war is not just about speed. It is about what happens when the initial momentum is lost, when your enemy, wounded but still alive, starts to fight back. The bleeding front had extended across the Pacific, from the Hawaiian Islands to the South China Sea, from the shores of Luzon to the jungles of Burma. It was a front with no clear boundaries, a conflict with no breaks. But the tide of history is always moving. And as the calendar moved into the spring of 1942, things began to change. The United States, although still recovering, had not been broken. And a tiny, isolated island named Midway, just over 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, was now in the crosshairs. The Japanese thought that one last blow would put an end to America's naval resistance. They did not know that America had been listening. They did not know about the cryptographers in Hawaii or the trap that was being laid beneath the waves. The bleeding would soon be stopped. And at Midway, the Empire's momentum would face its day of reckoning. A single bomb dropped from the sky could determine the destiny of a continent. A small group of planes, launched from fragile wooden decks, could shape the future of millions. It was a gamble with the highest possible stakes, fought over a small piece of coral and sand, floating in the vast blue of the Pacific Ocean. Midway Atoll, just 6 square miles of land, would become the place where empires clashed and destinies were decided. Midway was not a picturesque island. It was a flat piece of land, surrounded by reefs and shallow lagoons. Coconut palms swayed in the wind. The air was thick with salt and sweat, but its significance was anything but small. Imagine the Pacific Ocean as a huge, deadly chessboard. Each island was a critical square. Midway was near the center, like the King's Castle, between the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and the vast expanse of Asia, where Japan had been aggressively expanding. For the United States, Midway was the final line of defense before the heart of the Pacific. For Japan, it was a stepping stone, a chance to get closer to Hawaii and the American mainland. Its value came from one simple fact: aircraft. In the war that was raging across the Pacific, control of the skies meant control of the seas. Midway had an airstrip, an airbase that could launch fighter planes and bombers far beyond the island itself. It was like having a watchtower on the edge of the ocean, where planes could spot enemy ships, strike first, and warn their own forces. Without Midway, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's reach was limited. With Midway, they could challenge the vastness of the ocean, preventing Japan from moving freely. For Japan, taking Midway was not just a tactical win. It was a matter of strategic dominance. Admiral Yamamoto believed that by seizing Midway, Japan could lure the American fleet into a trap, a place where his superior naval forces could crush it once and for all. With Midway as a forward base, Japan's carriers and battleships could refuel, repair, and launch attacks deeper into enemy territory, moving the front lines closer to Hawaii and beyond. But Midway was not an easy target. Its reefs made landings difficult. Its garrison was small but resolute, made up of a few hundred Marines and technicians who understood the island's importance in the war. They were responsible for more than just defense. They kept the vital radio stations, weather observation posts, and early warning systems running, small threads in a vast web of intelligence. For those Marines, Midway was a remote outpost at the edge of the world. Mail from home was infrequent. Supplies came in irregularly. The heat was unbearable. Every day they got ready for the possibility of an attack, knowing that their small island could become the site of the greatest naval battle in history. But why Midway? Why not attack somewhere else? The answer was in the geography and the technology. The Pacific Ocean is huge, more than 60 million square miles. Finding enemy fleets was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The aircraft carriers, the new queens of naval warfare, were powerful but also vulnerable. They relied on their planes for both offense and defense. The further they were from friendly air bases, the riskier it was to operate. Midway was a critical middle point, allowing American aircraft to patrol large areas of the ocean, to attack approaching enemies, and to protect the vital sea lanes. Moreover, Midway was more than just an airstrip. It was a communications center, a listening post. The radio operators and codebreakers on Midway were intercepting Japanese transmissions. Their reports were being sent back to command centers thousands of miles away. In this invisible battle of signals and secrets, Midway was a key piece. For the Japanese, this made the island a threat that had to be eliminated. The plan was a bold one. Japan would launch a two-part attack. One force would feign an invasion of the Aleutian Islands, drawing the Americans' attention to the north. The main force would then attack Midway, destroy its airfield, and take control. This would compel the U.S. Navy to respond. And once the American fleet showed its position, Yamamoto's carriers would spring the trap. But such a plan depended on timing, secrecy, and a flawless execution. The men on Midway, mostly young Marines who had just finished their training, were not aware of the huge chess game that was being played around them. They were repairing runways, maintaining their anti-aircraft guns, and watching the horizon at every dawn and dusk. Their letters home were about the heat, the boredom, and the strange beauty of being so isolated. Yet behind their quiet routines, the tension was building. These were the sentinels on the front line of history. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., the military leaders knew that the battle for Midway was coming. Thanks to the breakthroughs in code breaking, American intelligence had started to figure out the Japanese plans. But there was still uncertainty. Where exactly would the attack take place? How strong was the enemy? How long could Midway survive a full-scale assault? The stakes were enormous. If Midway fell, the Pacific would be open to Japan's forces. Hawaii would be vulnerable, and America's ability to project its power across the ocean would be severely limited. The war's momentum, which had been in Japan's favor so far, would be reinforced. The sense of urgency was palpable in every command room, in every briefing. Yet if Midway held, if the Americans could catch the Japanese by surprise, if luck and courage were on the side of the defenders, then the tide of the war could turn. And all of this would come down to a few small islands and a few thousand men who were caught in the middle. As the sun rose and set over Midway, its coral sands were a silent witness to the invisible storm that was gathering overhead. On the decks of the aircraft carriers, the planes were being armed, fueled, and made ready. The messages were crackling in code. The commanders were staring at their maps, their faces tight with concentration. The ocean itself seemed to be holding its breath. On the island, the men were looking at the endless horizon, not knowing that the moment of reckoning was near. Their small outpost, this forgotten piece of land, would soon be the stage where empires would clash, lives would be lost, and the course of history would be decided. But in a war, even the smallest of places can carry the heaviest of burdens, and Midway was about to bear that burden like no other. The battle for the control of the Pacific was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It was now, and the world was watching, waiting for the outcome that would echo through the generations. Because in the vastness of the ocean, a small island held the key to everything, and whoever controlled Midway would control the future. In a small, dimly lit room on the island of Oahu, far from the roar of battleships and the thunder of planes, a different kind of war was being fought. A war of whispers, shadows, and secrets. The clatter of typewriters mixed with the low murmur of voices and the sharp scratch of pencils tracing coded messages. This was Station Hypo, the nerve center of U.S. Navy cryptography in the Pacific. Here, a handful of brilliant, determined men waged a battle that could tip the scales of the entire war. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle with pieces scattered across the world while the enemy constantly changes the picture. The Japanese Navy's secret codes were among the most complex in the world, a tangled web of symbols, numbers, and shifting keys designed to keep their plans hidden beneath layers of confusion. To crack them was to find the enemy's heartbeat, to hear their footsteps in the dark before they struck. For months, the cryptographers at Station Hypo had been locked in this invisible struggle. At the center of this effort was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man with a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an unshakable belief that his team could unravel the mystery of Japan's next move. Rochefort wasn't a soldier on the front lines. He didn't command ships or planes, but he held something equally powerful, the key to knowing the enemy's plans before they unfolded. And then came the code. Japanese messages were being intercepted daily, streams of characters sent across the airwaves, thought to be indecipherable. But slowly, piece by piece, the cryptographers began to see patterns, hints, and repeats. Among the jumble was a curious reference to a mysterious place labeled only as if no one knew what AF was. Was it an island? A code name for a fleet? A city? It was a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. The stakes were unimaginably high. If the Americans guessed wrong, the enemy's attack would come as a thunderbolt as devastating as Pearl Harbor. But if they guessed right, they could set a trap. They could prepare. They could fight back. To test their theory, Rochefort proposed a bold experiment, a risky gamble that blurred the line between intelligence and deception. They sent an uncoded message from Midway deliberately reporting that the island's water supply was low. They broadcast this message openly, knowing the Japanese would intercept it. It was like leaving a secret note in plain sight, daring the enemy to read it. Days passed. Then a reply came. The Japanese broadcast a message confirming that AF was short on water. It was the proof Rochefort and his team had prayed for. AF was Midway. With this revelation, the Americans could prepare for the assault that was coming. They could position their carriers, ready their planes, and steel their defenses. What had been a secret became an open secret. But this victory was not without cost. The work in Station Hypo was grueling. The cryptographers labored under pressure, often through long nights, working on a shoestring budget with few resources. Many were young men, driven by a mix of patriotism, curiosity, and the heavy burden of knowing that a single mistake could mean death for thousands. Rochefort himself had a rough, unpolished demeanor, sometimes clashing with the Navy's upper ranks. His team was small, underappreciated, and often overlooked. Yet their discoveries saved lives, changed strategies, and shifted the momentum of the war. Every intercepted message was a heartbeat of the enemy's plan. Every decoded word a step closer to victory or disaster. And as the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway, unaware that their secret was uncovered, the tension in that quiet Hawaiian room grew. The men waited, listened, and prepared, knowing that soon the fate of the Pacific would hinge on what they had uncovered. But the battle was far from over, because knowing the enemy's plan was only the first step. The real challenge was surviving what was to come. And so, the codebreakers of Station Hypo held their breath as history prepared to be made. The sun rose slowly over the Pacific, its golden light spilling across the endless waves, quiet, indifferent, eternal. But beneath that serene surface, forces were moving. Ships, aircraft, men, all part of a colossal game being played in silence. And at the center of this game was one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had seen war before. He had studied in America, walked its streets, understood its people, and feared its power. He knew that Japan's only chance of winning the Pacific War was to land a blow so devastating, so complete, that the Americans would lose the will to fight. And so he devised a masterpiece of naval strategy, a grand ambush, a trap cloaked in distance, deception, and overconfidence. He called it Operation Me. Midway, a tiny speck on the map, just two small islands, no bigger than a dot in the Pacific's vastness. But its location gave it power. From Midway, bombers could reach Pearl Harbor. From Midway, Japan could threaten the very heart of American control in the Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was simple in concept but impossibly complex in execution. Take Midway, draw the US Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, and annihilate it once and for all. He believed that the Americans, still licking their wounds from Pearl Harbor and desperate to defend their last line in the Central Pacific, would be forced to respond. And when they did, when they sent their precious aircraft carriers to defend Midway, he would be waiting. With 4 carriers, with hundreds of planes, with battleships lurking behind, ready to crush whatever survived. But to lure the Americans into the trap, he needed misdirection. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands far to the north would scatter the Americans' attention. It was a feint. One arm of the Japanese fleet would strike Alaska, drawing away precious carriers. Meanwhile, the real blow would fall on Midway, swiftly and overwhelmingly. Yamamoto broke his forces into several groups, something risky in naval warfare, especially across such vast distances. His main body, including the massive battleship Yamato, would remain far to the rear. The first mobile force, the Kido Butai, Japan's 4 elite carriers, would strike Midway directly. Then came the invasion force, loaded with troops to occupy the atoll once it was neutralized. A picket line of submarines was deployed to screen and detect any movement from Pearl Harbor. It was a grand illusion, layers upon layers of moving parts, each group moving like gears in a watch, all timed precisely. If it worked, it would cripple the US Navy and give Japan control of the Pacific. But there was a problem. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, the Americans had already cracked part of Japan's naval code. Station Hypo, an elite team of US Navy cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had intercepted and decrypted key messages from the Japanese Navy. The codename AF kept appearing in the transmissions, and through a clever trick involving a fake water shortage message they confirmed it. AF was Midway. With this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a bold choice. He would not fall into the trap. Instead, he would set his own. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown near Midway. They would lie in wait, hidden, silent, like daggers in the dark. The Japanese believed the Yorktown was sunk after the Battle of the Coral Sea. They had no idea she had limped back to Pearl Harbor, been patched together in just 3 days, and was already sailing back out to sea. Her decks still bore the scars of fire and bombs, but her crew was ready. Meanwhile, at Midway itself, the island braced for impact. Every man on the atoll knew what was coming. Pilots practiced takeoffs, bombers were loaded, and anti-aircraft guns were dug in. The coral airstrips shimmered under the heat, waiting for the battle to begin. Every American there understood that they were the shield, that if Midway fell, Hawaii could be next. And aboard the Japanese carriers, the mood was calm, even confident. On the Akagi's flight deck, pilots went through drills, mechanics checked engines, and bombs were hoisted into the bays. There was no sense of doom, only expectation. These were the same pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had swept across the Pacific in a wave of destruction. They believed they were invincible, but their confidence hid a terrible vulnerability, because the Americans were no longer guessing. They weren't reacting blindly. They were prepared. Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise, on secrecy, on perfect timing. But the ocean is vast, and radios cannot be silenced forever. His forces were spread too thin. His submarines arrived late, and the very strategy that made Operation Me so elegant made it dangerously fragile. He did not know that 3 American carriers were already in position. He did not know that Midway's defenders had dug in deep. He did not know that every piece of the puzzle was visible to the enemy. And so, as the sun rose on June 4, 1942, the trap Yamamoto had spent months preparing was about to be sprung, not by him but against him. All his fleets were in motion. His carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, were approaching from the northwest. The invasion fleet followed, and far behind, hidden by hundreds of miles, the main body waited, its massive guns silent. But there would be no decisive surface engagement. This was not going to be the battle Yamamoto had imagined. What he didn't know, what none of the Japanese commanders knew, was that within hours the skies above Midway would become a firestorm, that bombs and torpedoes would fall like rain, that ships would burn, that men would scream, fight, and die in seconds. That 4 of Japan's elite carriers, the very heart of its naval power, were sailing toward oblivion. Operation Me was a masterpiece of strategy, but like all masterpieces, it depended on illusion. And when the illusion shatters, reality bites hard. The Japanese fleet was still confident, still sailing forward, still unaware. And the American carriers were waiting in silence, engines idling, flight decks full, bombs armed. The battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific was now just hours away. The trap was set, and it was about to snap shut. The water was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward Midway Island, confident, disciplined, and unaware. On paper, they were unstoppable. They had destroyed Pearl Harbor. They had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales. They had taken the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Every fleet that had stood against them had either retreated or vanished beneath the waves. And now, they were coming for Midway. But this time, something was different. Someone was waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood alone with the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Pearl Harbor still smoldered in his memory. The American people were still reeling, desperate for hope. And here he was, just 6 months into the war, planning to send what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into what could only be described as a trap. And yet, he had a hunch based on scraps of code. It started with a mystery, a radio code the Japanese used, AF. The Americans had seen it before, buried inside intercepted messages. It was supposed to be a location, but which one? Nimitz wasn't a codebreaker, but he listened to the ones who were, and among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant, eccentric officer who wore bathrobes to work, chewed on cigars, and barely slept. He and his team at Station Hypo were obsessively listening, decoding, and comparing message fragments that came in drips and whispers. And Rochefort was sure AF meant Midway. But Nimitz had to be sure. There were lives at stake, ships, planes, the entire defense of the Pacific. So he let Rochefort run an experiment, have Midway send an unencrypted radio message pretending that their water distillation plant was broken. Days later, a Japanese message came through. AF reports low on water. That was the confirmation. It was Midway. And so began the gamble. Nimitz moved quickly. He had to. He ordered every available ship into action. The Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was hauled into Pearl Harbor like a wounded animal. Repair crews worked around the clock, 72 hours without rest, to patch the ship just enough to make it seaworthy. She would go to Midway with bandaged hulls and barely functioning equipment, like a boxer returning to the ring with broken ribs. Then came the positioning. Nimitz didn't have enough ships to go toe with the Japanese head-on. He had to outthink them, outsmart them. While Admiral Yamamoto believed the U.S. fleet was still licking its wounds, Nimitz hid his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, where the Japanese wouldn't expect them. He was playing a game of shadows, preparing to strike from an angle no one saw coming. But the stakes were terrifying. He was risking almost everything he had left. He was gambling on decoded messages, on faith in his people, on timing, on weather. He was placing the entire Pacific strategy in the hands of pilots barely out of training, commanders still learning on the job, and carriers patched together with hope and steel. And if he was wrong, if the Japanese changed course, or if the codebreakers had misread a single line, the US Navy could be wiped out in a single blow. To understand the scale of that risk, imagine playing poker. Now imagine that every chip on the table is a warship. Every card in your hand is an intercepted radio message. And across from you is Yamamoto, a man with more ships, more experience, and a proven record of victory. And you're bluffing. Nimitz wasn't reckless. He was calculated. He had learned from the loss at Pearl Harbor that waiting and reacting wasn't enough. He had to act first, boldly, decisively. And so he turned Midway into a fortress. He rushed fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes to the island. He dug in its defenses. He readied the island's radar and communications. He even made sure extra fuel and munitions were stockpiled. It was no longer just a target. It was bait. And the carriers, they would be the knife waiting in the dark. But none of this guaranteed victory, because war, no matter how well planned, is chaos. Pilots would miss their targets, ships would sink, men would die, and if just one piece of the puzzle fell out of place, if the Japanese spotted the American carriers first, it would be over. June approached. The messages kept coming. Japanese ships were moving. And yet, Nimitz couldn't see them, couldn't touch them, only believe. On June 3rd, a Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese invasion fleet heading toward Midway. Not the carriers yet, just troop transports, but it was confirmation. They were coming. Nimitz's hand trembled slightly as he signed off on the final deployment orders. The carriers steamed into position. Pilots were briefed, torpedoes were loaded, and still no one knew where the enemy's carriers were. Then, silence. Hours passed, then a day. Radio silence. No eyes on the fleet. No word from the scouts. Just the open ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. Some doubted. Some whispered that it was a mistake, that maybe the Japanese had changed their minds, that maybe they were striking elsewhere. But Nimitz remained still, watching, waiting. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese launched their first attack on Midway. Bombs fell, buildings burned. But Nimitz didn't blink. Because what Yamamoto didn't know, what none of the Japanese knew, was that just over the horizon, Hidden by clouds and waves, 3 American carriers were waiting. Engines were warming. Pilots were climbing into their cockpits. Flight decks were alive with activity. Radios crackled. Spotters scanned the skies. The trap was ready. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And as the sun climbed above the Pacific, the Battle of Midway began. Not with a roar, but with a decision. A decision made weeks earlier by one man standing in Pearl Harbor, looking at a map, and choosing to believe the whispers of a codebreaker in a bathrobe. The gamble had begun. Now, the world would find out if it would pay off or cost America the Pacific. The sea was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on a man's chest, as if the ocean itself is holding its breath. Somewhere in the haze and salt, American Marines dug deeper into the coral sand, scanning the horizon for a fleet they couldn't yet see but knew was coming. The air was thick, not with humidity, but with tension. One island, no bigger than a speck on most maps, stood between the rising sun of Japan and the heart of America's Pacific defense. Midway was no longer a forgotten outpost. It was a fortress now, or at least they hoped it was strong enough to be one. Midway Atoll, just 2 tiny islands, Sand and Eastern, sitting in the blue vastness of the Pacific, had become America's front line. Before, it was a remote naval base, a dot halfway between Asia and the West Coast. Now it was the bait in Admiral Nimitz's plan to turn the tide of the Pacific War, and that bait needed teeth. Dark clouds bruised the sky as the island braced for war. On the small speck of coral in the vast Pacific, sweat dripped from the brows of Marines, construction workers, and Navy men alike. Their hands were blistered, their nerves frayed, but their mission was clear: turn Midway into an unsinkable fortress before the enemy arrived. Time was bleeding away. Somewhere out there, the Japanese fleet was coming fast. Weeks earlier, Nimitz had made a gamble, one based entirely on whispers between codebreakers and radio signals from Japan. He trusted them, and now he needed to make this rocky outpost ready to withstand the full weight of the Empire of Japan. Supplies came fast, ferried in on transport ships, and dropped from the sky. Engineers swarmed across the coral, laying down airstrips like veins of steel. Huge slabs of pierced steel planking rattled beneath their boots, stretching out into runways that would host fighters, bombers, and patrol planes. Every inch of ground was carved and shaped to serve one purpose: resistance. The men dug trenches by hand, hacking through the coral with pickaxes. Bunkers made from sandbags and concrete rose like jagged scars across the island. Anti-aircraft guns sprouted from hidden emplacements. Radar towers stretched into the sky like skeletal arms. The Marines knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But they weren't out of time. Not yet. Major General Clarence Tinker watched as the planes screamed overhead. Some of them barely made it off the new runways. The air was thick with diesel fumes, fear, and salt. His pilots, mostly young boys from Kansas and California, tried to mask their nerves with jokes and cigarettes. But even the bravest among them knew they were standing in the path of a storm. The island's defenders included every branch: Navy, Army, Marines, and Coast Guard, over 3,000 men. Some were hardened veterans. Others had never seen a real enemy before. But they worked shoulder to shoulder, welding steel, unloading ammo, and training in the sweltering heat. Every man knew the truth. This island might not survive, but if it held, the war could change. Even the wildlife was disturbed. Albatrosses screamed over the runways. Crabs scuttled away from boot steps. Beneath it all, the sea murmured in its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the drama unfolding on land. Radar was a new weapon then, unproven and fragile. But Midway had it, and the operators trained day and night, scanning the skies for the first blips that would signal an incoming attack. It was like watching ghosts crawl across a green screen, hoping one of those echoes wasn't your death coming in fast. Fuel tanks were buried underground. Ammunition was stockpiled in hollowed-out recesses. Hospitals were prepped for mass casualties. The chapel held more men than ever, prayers mixing with the rumble of engines. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The Japanese were coming, and when they arrived, they would bring fire. The men slept in shifts. Some barely slept at all. The nights were full of hammering and shouting, engines and alarms. On the horizon, the dark shape of war drew closer. Midway was becoming something else, less an island, more a trigger. Pilots ran drills, taking off and landing until the steel beneath their wheels blistered in the sun. Anti-aircraft crews trained with live rounds, their fingers raw from handling the shells. Discipline was tight, morale tighter. There was no margin for error. Scouts flew long-range missions daily, scanning for signs of the enemy. Every ripple in the ocean, every shape in the clouds brought suspicion. And then finally, a coded message crackled through the air. The Japanese were on the move. The trap was set. The bait was ready. Now the waiting was over. June 3rd, 1942. The enemy was here, and Midway, for all its coral, steel and sweat, would soon be tested in the fire of battle. A fortress not by stone, but by will. By dawn, the Pacific would bleed. The USS Yorktown was dying. Her decks were torn apart, her hull was cracked, and her crew was scattered, wounded, exhausted, and their hearts were full of fear. Just days earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had taken the kind of beating that usually sent ships to the bottom. Fires had raged across her flight deck. Ruptured fuel lines had flooded her compartments, and explosions had rocked her steel bones. Even the most optimistic estimates gave her weeks, maybe months, before she could ever see open water again. And yet, time was the one thing Admiral Chester Nimitz didn't have. The Japanese fleet was coming fast. In the dark, smoke-scarred belly of Pearl Harbor, a miracle was about to unfold. This is the story of how a crippled warship, written off by nearly everyone, was reborn in just 72 hours, 3 days, by sheer willpower, grit, and human ingenuity. This wasn't just a tale of machines and tools. It was a story of sweat-soaked overalls, busted knuckles, midnight oil, and the defiant belief that the impossible could be done. At Pier 4, the Yorktown pulled in slowly, groaning, wounded. Her flight deck had a massive hole punched through it. Her electrical systems were down, her boilers were damaged, and she leaked fuel like a sieve. Normally, repairs like this would take 90 days at least. That was the Navy standard, but Nimitz gave them 3, not weeks, but days. The order sounded like madness. But in that chaos, he saw something else. He saw an opportunity to tip the balance in what would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Nimitz wasn't a gambler by nature, but this was the bet of a lifetime. The Japanese were sailing with confidence, expecting to catch the Americans off guard at Midway. Nimitz intended to surprise them instead, with the Yorktown. The workers at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard didn't waste a second. Within hours, over 1,000 men had swarmed the carrier like ants on a wounded beast. Welders threw up sparks that lit the night like fireflies. Electricians worked by flashlight, their hands trembling with fatigue but refusing to stop. Engineers crawled into the deepest guts of the ship, patching steam lines and sealing ruptures with whatever they could find. They weren't just fixing metal, they were resurrecting hope. There was no sleep, no margin for error, no room for failure. Food was delivered to the workers on deck. Men rotated in shifts, so someone was always drilling, welding, hammering. By the second day, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and noise, a kind of organized chaos that only happens when everyone knows the clock is ticking louder with every heartbeat. Chief petty officers barked orders while their own hands bled from the work. Sailors who had served on the Yorktown refused to rest. They stayed to help, haunted by the idea that their ship might not return to fight. One machinist's mate later said, "It was like watching a loved one in surgery. We didn't know if she'd make it, but we had to try." Even the docks became extensions of the ship. Giant cranes whirled through the air, lowering replacement parts that had been cannibalized from other vessels. Nothing was sacred. If a working generator was needed, another ship would give it up. This wasn't just one repair job. It was a national effort condensed into a few football fields of steel and fire. And somehow, it worked. 72 hours after limping into port, the USS Yorktown pulled away from the dock under her own power, still battered, still bruised, but alive. She could sail. She could launch planes. She could fight, but the damage beneath her decks ran deeper than metal. The crew knew what they were sailing into. The Pacific was about to erupt again, and this time they were heading straight into the teeth of it. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the task force commander, stepped back aboard the Yorktown with grim resolve. The ship, still smelling of burnt metal and fresh paint, groaned as if waking from a coma. Her flight deck crews ran drills, the pilots checked their planes, and the damage control teams triple-checked every line and seal. They knew that the Japanese were coming with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū. Each was brimming with experienced pilots and war-tested aircraft. The Yorktown would be one of only 3 American carriers standing in their way. The odds were brutal. The margin for error was non-existent. But the Yorktown wasn't just steel and engines anymore. She was a symbol, a middle finger to defeat. A reminder that Americans didn't just repair things. They resurrected them, that when cornered, they didn't fold, they fought back. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 3rd, the Yorktown and her escorting ships steamed toward destiny, her decks silent for a moment, her engines humming low, as if the sea itself held its breath. The miracle of her return was complete, but would it be enough? Because ahead, hidden somewhere across the waves, was the most powerful carrier strike force the world had ever seen, led by Admiral Nagumo, a man with blood in his eyes and fire on his decks. And the battle for Midway was just about to begin. The wind howled like a ghost's lament across the cold, barren Aleutian Islands. Rain sliced through the grey skies, the ocean roaring beneath with angry swells. Far from the tropical heat of Midway, this remote stretch of volcanic rock and frozen tundra was about to become a stage for a high-stakes deception, a calculated move in a deadly chess game. It was June 3rd, 1942. As the men on Midway waited, tension tightening like a coiled spring, a shadow fleet sailed stealthily northward under the cloak of storms. The Japanese Imperial Navy was launching a 2-pronged attack. While most eyes were focused on the small coral atoll, the Empire sent aircraft carriers and warships toward the Aleutian chain, aiming to seize the islands of Attu and Kiska. To most Americans, the Aleutians were a forgotten stretch of wilderness, harsh and inhospitable. But to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, they were a perfect distraction, an elegant ruse, designed to pull the American fleet's attention away from Midway, the true prize. The idea was simple but brilliant in its audacity: create confusion, force the enemy to divide their forces, and then strike the decisive blow. The plan unfolded under stormy skies as Japanese bombers roared over Dutch Harbor, a small U.S. outpost on an Alaskan island. Explosions shattered the silence. Shrapnel rained down on hastily dug foxholes, and buildings erupted in fire. American defenders scrambled, their anti-aircraft guns rattling into life. Pilots in outdated fighters raced to intercept, their engines straining against the cold winds. The attack stunned the defenders. For a moment, it seemed the Aleutian strike might be the main assault, the true focus of Japan's expansive campaign. The specter of Japanese forces on American soil sparked alarm in Washington and beyond. Yet, in the command center at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz remained calm. Thanks to the tireless work of the Codebreakers, men who had cracked the secrets of the Japanese naval code JN-25, Nimitz knew the truth. The Aleutian attack was a feint, a diversion meant to mislead. The heart of Japan's strike force still aimed for Midway. Nimitz's steady resolve was as much a weapon as any battleship. Unlike many who might have been rattled by the northern attack, he held his course. He kept his carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, focused on the trap set near Midway. The gamble was enormous. Ignore an assault on American soil to win a battle that could turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. Meanwhile, in the freezing Aleutian archipelago, American forces fought a desperate defense. Dutch Harbor's anti-aircraft batteries barked into the fog, while scattered fighter planes engaged in dogfights over the rocky cliffs and icy waters. The Japanese landed troops on Attu and Kiska, marking the first enemy occupation of American territory since the War of 1812. The psychological shock was profound, a stark reminder that the war was truly global. Yet, the Aleutian campaign was a costly distraction for the Japanese. The harsh weather, the rough seas, and the supply difficulties slowed their advance. The rugged terrain proved unforgiving to both invaders and defenders alike, and most critically, it failed to divert Nimitz's attention from Midway. This was the fatal flaw in Yamamoto's design. His plan had underestimated not only American resolve, but the precision of US intelligence. The Codebreakers' work had turned deception into clarity, turning chaos into a map that allowed Nimitz to hold firm. Back on Midway, the men dug trenches with grim determination, loaded their guns with painstaking care, and fueled their aircraft for the battle they knew was imminent. The pilots checked their weapons, studied their maps, and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. They understood that this was more than a battle. It was a test of survival, of national will. Far across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet approached, unaware that their diversion had failed. Their confidence was high, their plans meticulous, but the trap was set. The bait was ready. The Aleutian skies, wild and unyielding, whispered a cold truth. Sometimes the loudest storm is just a distraction from the real battle raging silently elsewhere. And as the sun set on June 3, 1942, the fate of the Pacific rested on a razor's edge. What followed would echo through history and change the world forever. The first light of dawn was barely brushing the endless Pacific when an urgent message shattered the tense calm aboard the American fleet. Enemy in sight, bearing northwest, multiple ships, carriers among them. The words crackled over the radio like a lifeline thrown into the fog of war. For hours, the vast ocean had been a quiet, vast expanse, deceptive in its stillness. But now, out on the horizon, a dark silhouette had emerged. The Imperial Japanese Navy's invasion force, a massive armada carrying the fate of nations on its steel decks and roaring engines. The men in those American patrol planes felt the crushing weight of that discovery, a mix of hope, fear, and the grim knowledge that the real battle was about to begin. Pilots in rugged, worn planes tightened their grips on their controls, their hearts pounding as adrenaline surged. They were the eyes of the fleet, tasked with locating the enemy before the enemy found them. The sun had just begun to cast its pale light when the first waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes took off from Midway and the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. These were men who had trained for this moment, but now faced the terrifying uncertainty of battle. Many were barely out of their teens. Some carried tokens from home, a photograph, a letter, a small trinket tucked close, a talisman against death. Their voices, when they spoke, were tight with tension. Yet beneath the fear burned a fierce determination. The planes streaked through the sky like arrows, their engines screaming, their eyes fixed on the distant fleet. But the Japanese were no easy target. Their ships moved with a disciplined precision, their anti-aircraft guns opening up with a thunderous fury, sending trails of smoke and flak into the air. Despite their bravery, the American attacks failed to hit their marks. Bombs fell short or wide. Torpedoes veered off in the churning seas. Some pilots returned with bullet-riddled planes, their bodies battered, their spirits weighed down by the bitter sting of near misses and lost chances. Back on the flight decks, mechanics and crews braced for the wounded. Some rushed to patch up damaged aircraft. Others whispered prayers for friends who might never return. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every missed strike was a moment lost, a chance the enemy might seize. Yet amidst the chaos, there was an unyielding hope. The fact that the fleet had been spotted first meant the tide could still turn. The Americans had an edge, knowledge. They knew where the enemy was, and they were preparing to strike again. On board the Yorktown, still recovering from repairs, the hum of activity was relentless. Men worked feverishly to rearm the planes, check the engines, and prepare for another sortie. Sweat mixed with oil as hands worked with a precision born of necessity. The pilots checked their gear, their faces set in a grim determination, aware that their next chance might be their last. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the island's defenders were on edge. The Marines and soldiers scanned the horizon and the sky, loading artillery and readying aircraft. Every man knew the stakes. The enemy was close, and the battle for survival was imminent. The air buzzed with anticipation and dread. Communications crackled with updates, fears, and fragments of hope. This was no longer preparation. It was the first step in a deadly dance of attack and counterattack. The Japanese fleet remained unaware that their presence had been revealed. They continued their advance, confident in their power and their mission, but the element of surprise had slipped from their grasp. This initial American air attack, though failing to score decisive hits, sent a clear message: the fight was underway. The defenders were ready to meet the storm, and the real battle, the one that would echo through history, was just beginning. In the moments to come, every pilot, sailor, and soldier would face choices that would define not just the outcome of a battle, but the fate of the Pacific War. The sky, now brightening, held its breath. The Pacific was ready to bleed. June 4th, 1942. The faint glow of dawn barely pierced the thick veil of humid ocean mist hovering over Midway Atoll, a remote cluster of coral islands and reefs miles away from any mainland. Yet on this day, this tiny speck in the vast Pacific Ocean was about to become the focal point of a titanic clash that would alter the course of history. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the thunderous drone of hundreds of aircraft engines, cutting through the fragile morning calm. Japanese warplanes swarmed the skies above Midway, darkening the pale blue like a thick cloud of locusts descending to devour everything in their path. Midway was under fire. Below, the island's defenders scrambled amid the chaos. Marines, soldiers, pilots, mechanics. Each man moved with a grim purpose. Their world had narrowed to the desperate task of survival. These men faced not only enemy bombs but the immense weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. The island itself was small, a handful of airstrips carved from coral and sand, a scattering of wooden barracks and fuel depots, but it held an outsized importance. Midway was the linchpin of America's Pacific defense, a critical forward base from which the U.S. Navy could monitor enemy movements and launch counterattacks. Losing it would have opened the door for Japanese domination of the Pacific. The first Japanese bombs fell with a terrible precision. Explosions tore into the coral airstrips, cracking the surface, ripping apart planes, and sending clouds of smoke and flame billowing into the sky. Barracks and supply dumps erupted in fireballs. The ground itself trembled beneath the assault, and the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with the salty ocean breeze. The island shook as if the very earth was under siege. The men defending Midway faced this inferno with whatever weapons they had. Their aircraft were aging and outmatched. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, sturdy but slower and less maneuverable than the sleek Mitsubishi Zeros and Aichi Vals screaming toward them. Many of these planes had been hastily patched together after long months of patrols. Yet, despite their limitations, the pilots climbed into their cockpits with a fierce determination. These were young men, barely out of their teens in some cases, who understood the stakes as clearly as their commanders. The survival of the island, their comrades, and perhaps the Pacific itself, depended on their courage. The anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their positions, their hands moving rapidly yet carefully as they loaded shell after shell into their cannons and machine guns. Their weapons were older models, some brought from bases across the continent, not designed for this scale of assault. Still, their firepower erupted in defiant staccato bursts, tracer rounds painting fiery arcs through the sky. These bursts of light and smoke were desperate prayers woven into the fabric of battle, a fiery barrier between the island and destruction. Many of these men fought through exhaustion and fear, gripping their guns with shaking hands but never lowering their sights. Some gunners would later recall firing until their arms felt numb, their muscles burning, unwilling to yield even as enemy bullets tore through the air around them. Up in the sky, dogfights erupted amid the roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. American fighters, despite being outnumbered and outclassed, lunged into combat with a reckless courage. Their planes twisted and dived through clouds of flak and enemy tracers, seeking any opening to strike. Every engagement was a brutal contest of wills. The sky became a deadly dance, a desperate game of cat and mouse, where seconds decided life or death. Many pilots would never return from these missions, their planes spiraling down into the ocean or bursting into flame. On the ground, the men worked feverishly to keep the island's defenses operational. Mechanics scrambled to refuel and rearm battered planes, while engineers patched up damaged runways under the constant threat of renewed bombing. The roar of engines and explosions blended with shouted orders and the frantic clatter of boots on gravel. Communication lines crackled with tension as officers coordinated the defense efforts, directing fighters, calling down artillery fire, and rallying the troops to hold the line. The human cost was immediate and staggering. Young men who had written letters home just days before now lay wounded or dead amid the ruins of their base. Their faces, frozen in photographs, tell stories of hope, fear, and determination. A pilot, wounded in the leg, refused to bail out, guiding his crippled plane away from friendly forces and crashing into the sea. A gunner kept firing even after shrapnel pierced his arm, his eyes locked on the enemy until he could no longer stand. Medics weaved through the smoke and debris, their hands steady despite the chaos, tending to the wounded with a quiet heroism that often went unseen. The island's radar stations, the vital eyes that had given the defenders an early warning, buzzed with frantic activity. The operators tracked every incoming wave of attackers and fed this information to the command centers where the officers made split-second decisions. This intelligence was a lifeline, a thin thread of control in a swirling storm of violence. Orders issued over crackling radios directed the fighters to intercept, focus the artillery fire on the approaching planes, and kept the defenders coordinated despite the turmoil. But despite their bravery and tenacity, the men of Midway faced overwhelming odds. Bombs tore through the buildings, the runways cracked and splintered, the fires raged out of control, and the ammunition dwindled. The island was bleeding. Still, the spirit of its defenders was unbroken. Every moment of resistance bought precious time. Time for reinforcements to arrive, and time for the larger battle that was unfolding beyond the horizon. Somewhere far out at sea, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown were preparing to launch their own strikes against the Japanese fleet. The bravery of the island's defenders was part of a larger, desperate gambit, a gamble that hinged on courage, skill, and a measure of luck. As the day wore on, the skies above Midway remained a chaotic tempest of fire and smoke. Each wave of Japanese aircraft brought new devastation, but each was met with a fierce resistance. The defenders were battered but unbowed, and beneath the smoke and the shattered coral, a question loomed: how long could Midway hold? How many more lives would be sacrificed before the tide of the war turned? The morning of June 4th was only the opening chapter of a battle that would echo through history, a battle of bravery, sacrifice, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. Midway was burning, but it was not yet broken. The heart of the Pacific War was beating fiercely on. The storm had only just begun. June 4th, 1942. The fragile Pacific dawn was barely breaking when the first American torpedo bombers rose from their carriers' decks, their engines roaring into the cool morning air. The mission that awaited them was as daring as it was desperate: to strike directly at the core of the Japanese fleet without the protection of a fighter escort. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū were waiting, their decks bristling with aircraft and deadly anti-aircraft guns. For the men flying the Douglas TBD Devastators, this was a near-suicidal charge into the jaws of an enemy that was far more agile and better equipped in the skies. These planes were relics of an earlier era, slow and lumbering compared to the sleek Mitsubishi Zero fighters that prowled overhead. The Devastator was a torpedo bomber designed to fly low and slow, releasing its weapon at just the right moment, a steady, straight flight path that made the plane a perfect target. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, these pilots climbed into their cockpits with their faces set in a grim determination, steeling themselves for the fight ahead. Many were barely more than boys, but in their eyes burned a fierce resolve, the hope that their sacrifice could turn the tide of the war. As the torpedo squadrons approached the Japanese fleet, the skies erupted with violence. Flak bursts of explosive shells designed to shred aircraft exploded around them in terrifying clouds of smoke and shrapnel. Japanese Zero fighters dove in, slicing through the air with a ruthless precision. The Devastators, burdened by their heavy torpedoes and their slow speed, were easy prey. One by one, the planes were torn apart. Flames erupted, wings were shredded, and engines exploded in fiery bursts. The ocean below caught the wreckage of the doomed air crews as they plunged toward the sea. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and the roar of machine guns. But still, the torpedo bombers pressed forward, undeterred by the carnage that was unfolding around them. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, was a figure of unyielding bravery. Waldron had rallied his men into a tight formation and had pressed the attack with a relentless courage. Despite being under a constant fire, he refused to break his formation or to retreat. His squadron was almost entirely wiped out, but their attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver sharply to avoid the torpedoes. This movement disrupted their fighter screen, the wall of protective fighters that was circling the fleet, leaving openings that would soon be exploited by the next wave of American attackers. The losses among the torpedo squadrons were devastating. Nearly all of the 40 planes that had taken off were destroyed or forced to turn back. Few of the pilots survived the hellish encounter. Those who did were haunted by the sight of their comrades falling, consumed by fire or lost in the endless ocean. But in their sacrifice lay a vital spark. Their attack had broken the rhythm of the Japanese defense, and for the first time in the battle, the enemy appeared to be vulnerable. Back on the decks of the American carriers, the mood was somber. The crews mourned their fallen friends, even as they prepared for the next wave of attacks. The letters sent home after the battle would tell the tales of the young men who had faced death with steady eyes and a quiet resolve, who knew they might never see their families again, but who flew anyway. The price they had paid was immense, but so was the courage they had shown. The Japanese fleet, confident in their skill and their superior machines, was stunned by the ferocity of the torpedo attacks. Their pilots scrambled to respond, but the disruption in their formations had created dangerous gaps. The tight coordination of the Japanese air defense was broken. Their carriers, the core of their offensive power, were suddenly exposed. Into this chaos, the American dive bombers moved, fast, agile, and deadly. These planes were poised to strike with a precision, but their success depended entirely on the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. Without the distraction and the disruption that had been caused by those brave crews, the dive bombers would never have found the weak points in the enemy's defenses. The torpedo squadron's sacrifice would become one of the most poignant and heroic moments of the Battle of Midway. Though they had failed to score any hits themselves, their courage had bought time and had created openings that had changed the course of the battle. Their story is one of a grim determination in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to the cost of a victory and the valor of those who give everything for their country. As the sun rose higher and the battle raged on, the memory of those torpedo pilots hung in the air like a solemn vow, a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and that it would pave the way for a victory. June 4, 1942. The vast Pacific Ocean was cloaked in a thick, acrid smoke. The sun hung low, its rays barely piercing through the haze of war. The skies, once eerily calm before the storm, were now torn asunder by the roaring engines of the American dive bombers. This was the moment that would change everything, a moment that was forged in a sacrifice, a courage, and a razor-sharp timing. For hours, the battle had raged. The brave torpedo squadrons had flown headlong into a deadly hail of an enemy fire. Their sacrifice was staggering but necessary. Their attacks had broken the Japanese defensive formations, forcing the enemy carriers to maneuver desperately and to splinter their fighter screens. Though the torpedo bombers had been almost entirely wiped out, their unyielding courage had bought a critical opening. Now, soaring through the smoke-choked sky, came the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown, planes that were designed for a speed, a precision, and a deadly power. These pilots carried the hopes of a nation, each one knowing that a success or a failure here could shape the entire course of the Pacific War. As the dive bombers approached, the Japanese fleet appeared as a sprawling fortress of a steel and a fire. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū were caught in a chaotic scramble. On their decks, the sailors and the air crews rushed to refuel and to rearm their planes, unaware that the American attackers were closing in faster than anyone had expected. The scene below was like a simmering volcano on the brink of an eruption. The fuel tanks were vulnerable, the bombs sat ready to be loaded, and the planes were tightly packed, all a perfect tinder for a disaster. The dive bombers reached their release points at an incredible speed, in a breathtaking synchronized ballet of a destruction. They pulled steep, nearly vertical dives toward their targets, suspended for a heartbeat between a sky and a sea. Each pilot released their bombs with a surgical precision. The payload screamed downward, slamming into the flight decks, the hangars, and the fuel stores. The explosions roared. The showers of a burning debris cascaded into the ocean, and the towering infernos burst into a life. The carriers, once the symbols of a Japanese naval power, now became the floating tombs of a fire and a chaos. On the Akagi, a bomb tore through the hangar deck, igniting the fuel and the ammunition. The flames spread like a wildfire, and the ship began to list, its crew fighting a losing battle to save their vessel. Nearby, the Kaga suffered a similar fate. Multiple bomb hits tore through its decks, triggering the catastrophic fires. The heat became unbearable. The men were trapped below the decks while the others fought to contain the blaze. The carrier's structure groaned under the strain, its decks buckling and twisting as the explosions shattered the bulkheads. The Sōryū, too, was engulfed. A direct hit from a well-placed bomb pierced its flight deck, sparking a chain reaction of explosions. The ship's once proud silhouette was quickly swallowed by a smoke and a flame. From the American carriers, the sailors watched in a stunned silence. Then, as the gravity of the moment settled, the cheers erupted, a cathartic release of a hope and a triumph. The tide of the battle had shifted, and the Japanese fleet was reeling under the precise, devastating blows. Yet amid the celebration, a tension remained high. The fourth Japanese carrier, the Hiryū, was still operational and had launched the counterattacks that had damaged the USS Yorktown. The battle was far from decided. In the air, the dive bomber pilots prepared to press their advantage. Many had witnessed their comrades fall in the earlier attacks. Now, fueled by a fierce determination and the memory of a sacrifice, they pushed on, ready to strike again and to finish what the torpedo squadrons had started. Below, the men on the burning Japanese carriers faced a horror that was beyond an imagining. The fires raged unchecked. The explosions rocked the ships, sending the shock waves through the water. For many, it was a final, desperate struggle to save what remained, or to abandon their ship before the flames consumed them. The destruction of the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Sōryū within such a short span was unprecedented. These were the backbone of Japan's offensive might, and their loss would cripple the Imperial Navy's capacity to wage a war in the Pacific. Back on the American side, a victory came with its own cost. The USS Yorktown, though still afloat, was heavily damaged. Her crew fought heroically to keep her from sinking, patching the holes and controlling the flooding amid the ongoing air raids. The Battle of Midway was a brutal clash of the wills, the machines, and the men. It was a contest not only of a technology and a strategy, but of a heart and a sacrifice. The arrival of the dive bombers, striking at the precise moment when the enemy was the most vulnerable, proved to be the turning point. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific, illuminating the smoking wreckage of the once mighty Japanese carriers. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The US Navy had dealt a staggering blow, one that would echo through a history. In those moments, the courage of the countless men from the torpedo squadrons who had flown into a near certain death to the dive bomber pilots who had seized their chance had rewritten the fate of the Pacific War. Their sacrifice and their valor would be remembered forever as the turning point where a hope had risen from the ashes of a devastation. June 4, 1942. The battle that would come to define the Pacific War was a volatile storm that was raging across thousands of miles of an open ocean. The Japanese fleet had already suffered the devastating losses. 3 of their mighty carriers lay burning or sinking beneath the waves, the victims of the unrelenting assault by the American dive bombers. But amid the wreckage and the smoke, the 4th carrier, the Hiryū, remained a fierce and a dangerous threat. While the American fleet was still catching its breath from the shock and the awe of the morning strikes, the Hiryū's crew worked with a grim determination. Their ship, though it was battered and scarred, was alive, still capable of launching an aircraft, still a potent instrument of a war. On her flight deck, the pilots scrambled into their planes, their engines roaring to a life, ready to exact a brutal vengeance. From the hangar decks to the bridge, the men moved with an urgent purpose. There was no time to mourn the fallen or to dwell on the destruction of the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Sōryū. The Hiryū had to fight to keep Japan's last chance alive, fight to turn the tide of a battle that now seemed to be slipping away. The air crackled with attention as the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and the Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers prepared for a takeoff. Their engines thundered. Their pilots' faces were set with a steely resolve. They knew the stakes, the survival of their fleet, and perhaps the fate of their nation, rested on this strike. Escorted by the swift and the deadly Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, the strike group surged into the skies, slicing through the smoke and the chaos above the ocean. Below, the American fleet braced, their radar and their lookouts scanning for the next wave of the attackers. The men on the USS Yorktown, still reeling from an earlier damage but resolute, scrambled to their battle stations. Despite a fierce anti-aircraft fire, the Japanese attack wave pressed relentlessly forward. Their bombs and their torpedoes found the critical targets on the Yorktown's starboard side, ripping through a steel and igniting the fuel stores. The ship lurched under the impact, a fire and a smoke billowing from the multiple points. The roar of the explosions, the shouts of the men, the frantic scramble to control the flooding and the fires, all played out in a deadly ballet of a chaos and a courage. The sailors were thrown to the decks or overboard. Some fought bravely to save their shipmates, while the others tended to the wounded amid the roar of a battle. The strike from the Hiryū was a harsh reminder that though it was damaged, the Japanese fleet was not yet defeated. The carrier's pilots pressed their advantage, continuing to harass and to attack, forcing the Americans into a fierce defensive posture. Yet, even as the Hiryū's planes wreaked havoc, the Americans rallied. The fighter planes scrambled to intercept, the guns blazed in the sky, and the damage control teams below the decks worked feverishly to patch the gaping wounds that had been inflicted on the Yorktown. The cost was immense on both sides. The Hiryū's pilots knew they were risking everything, diving into a storm of a flak and a machine to gunfire. The Americans paid dearly as well, with the men who were killed or wounded in the onslaught, and the mighty Yorktown that was limping under a heavy damage. The clash between the Hiryū and the American fleet was not just a battle of the ships and the planes. It was a battle of the wills, of a spirit and a tenacity. Every bomb that was dropped, every shell that was fired was a desperate bid to tip the scales. But the tide was turning. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons and the timely arrival of the dive bombers had already shattered the Japanese attack. The Hiryū's counterstrike, while it was fierce and deadly, could not undo the devastating damage that had been sustained by her sister carriers. Still, in those intense moments, the Hiryū's revenge was a grim testament to the brutal realities of a war, where a victory and a loss were separated by the thinnest of margins, and every act of a courage came at an immense cost. As the smoke thickened and the sun dipped low, the fate of the Hiryū and the entire Japanese fleet hung in the balance. The next moves would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but the future course of the Pacific War. June 4, 1942. The Pacific sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the endless ocean in the hues of an orange and a crimson, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of a smoke and a fire that now marked the battlefield. The mighty Imperial Japanese carrier Hiryū, the last survivor of her once powerful strike force, still floated on the restless sea. But her fate was sealed. For hours, the Hiryū had been the relentless, vengeful spirit of the Japanese fleet. Her air crews had launched the wave after the wave of the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers, pounding the battered American fleet, especially the crippled USS Yorktown. The courage of those pilots, braving the swarms of the American fighters, the fierce anti-aircraft fire and the perils of the open sea, was unquestionable. They were fighting not just for a ship, but for the honor of their fleet and the survival of their nation. But now, as the evening deepened, the tide of the battle was turning with a terrifying finality. From the decks of the American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, the pilots prepared for a counterstrike that would seal the fate of the Hiryū. Despite her fatigue, the relentless pounding and the ever-present danger, They climbed into their dive bombers once again. Their faces were etched with an exhaustion, but their eyes burned with a resolve. This mission was their last, their chance to end the nightmare and to claim a victory that would echo through a history. The sea below churned, a dark mirror that was reflecting the fiery chaos that engulfed the carriers and the ships alike. The air was thick with a smoke and the acrid scent of a burning fuel and a metal. On board the American ships, the men held their breath, their eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of the enemy's approach. Suddenly, like the falcons that were diving from the sky, the American dive bombers appeared. Their engines screamed through the smoke-filled air as they made their final deadly descent toward the Hiryū. The pilots clutched their controls with a white-knuckled intensity, each second stretching into an eternity. With a pinpoint precision, the bombs were released, thundering into the Hiryū's flight deck and the hangar. The explosions rocked the carrier, sending the shock waves through her steel frame. A fire erupted instantly, fueled by the stored aviation gasoline and the munitions that were packed tightly within her decks. The flames roared like a living beast, consuming everything in their path. Inside the ship, a chaos and a courage collided. The crew fought desperately to control the inferno, spraying a water and a foam in a losing battle against the furious blaze. The men screamed the orders, they fought the fires, they tended to the wounded, and they prepared for the inevitable. The heat was unbearable, the smoke was thick and choking. The carrier groaned under the strain, her decks buckled and cracked, twisted by the heat and the explosions. The bright flames lit the faces of the sailors, etched with a determination and a fear, some praying silently, the others readying to abandon their ship. The Hiryū's list grew steadily worse, her proud silhouette leaning toward the dark, hungry sea beneath. The ocean's cold embrace waited patiently, ready to reclaim what had once been a symbol of a Japanese naval might. Then, in a final moment that was heavy with a tragedy and a valor, the Hiryū slipped beneath the waves, dragged down by the weight of a fire, a destruction and a loss. Her disappearance marked the death knell for Japan's carrier fleet at Midway and the end of their hopes for a control of the Pacific. Back on the American carriers, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of a relief and a sorrow. The cost of a victory had been staggering, the lives that were lost, the ships that were damaged, and the brutal reality of a war that was laid bare. Yet, the destruction of the Hiryū marked a turning point in the Pacific War, a shift in a power that would ripple through the coming years. The men who had fought and died that day would be remembered as the heroes, not just for their skill and their bravery, but for their sacrifice in a battle that had changed the course of a history. As the night settled over the Pacific, the smouldering remains of the battle faded into a darkness. But the legacy of Midway and of the Hiryū's final moments would burn brightly in the hearts and the minds of all who had survived and in the pages of a history forever. June 5th, 1942. The early morning light spilled softly over the restless Pacific Ocean, painting the waves with a fragile glow that belied the grim reality below the surface. The Battle of Midway, which had been raging fiercely for days, had left its scars on both fleets. Among the battered remnants of the U.S. Navy's striking force, the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown stood as a testament to a grit and a determination. Severely damaged in the earlier attacks, she had undergone a miraculous around-the-clock repair effort in just 72 hours, a feat of a naval engineering and a sheer willpower that had allowed her to rejoin the battle. Yet, a fate had more trials in store. As the dawn broke, the sea appeared to be calm, almost serene. But lurking beneath the tranquil surface, a danger prowled unseen. The Japanese submarine 168, a silent predator that was lurking in the depths, had stalked the damaged carrier. With a deadly patience, it closed the distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The I-168's mission was clear, to finish what the earlier air attacks had started, and to sink the Yorktown for good. On board the Yorktown, the crew was worn, but their spirits remained steadfast. The men moved quickly, tending to the wounded, fighting the lingering fires, and shoring up the bulkheads that had been weakened by the torpedoes and the bombs. The smell of assault, a smoke, and a burned fuel hung heavy in the air. The ship, though it was wounded, was a symbol of a resilience, a bulwark against the storm of a war. Without a warning, An eerie silence was shattered by the piercing sound of the alarms that were blaring throughout the ship. The words, "Torpedo incoming," cut through the air like a knife. The crew sprang into an action, trained for this very moment, though the terror in their eyes betrayed the enormity of the threat. The damage control teams rushed to their stations. The gunners scrambled to man their weapons. The bridge buzzed with the urgent commands. The water beside the Yorktown suddenly erupted as the first torpedo slammed into the hull amidships. The explosion sent the shockwaves throughout the ship, violently shaking her steel frame and throwing the men off their feet. The bulkheads buckled under the immense pressure, and as seawater surged into the lower compartments, the flames ignited from the ruptured fuel lines, sending the plumes of a black smoke skyward. The once majestic carrier was now a battlefield unto itself. Yet amid the chaos, the crew's resolve hardened. Like the firefighters who were battling an overwhelming blaze, the damage control parties poured water onto the fires, sealed the flooded compartments, and fought to stabilize their ship. They knew that the Yorktown's survival depended on every second they could buy, but the I-168 was relentless. Minutes later, a second torpedo tore into the stern, crippling the carrier's engines and knocking out her steering capabilities. The ship began to list, her decks tilting ominously toward the dark waters below. The power that had once propelled the Yorktown forward faltered, and the great vessel now seemed to struggle just to stay afloat. The men on the deck clung to the rails, their faces a mix of an exhaustion, a fear, and an unyielding determination. The cries of the wounded echoed above the thunderous roar of the engines and the hissing escape of a steam from the damaged pipes. The sea, once a source of a strength and a freedom, had transformed into a looming threat. As the situation worsened, the order was given, "Abandon ship." The lifeboats were lowered into the turbulent waters. The sailors helped one another over the rails, some hesitating as the weight of a duty clashed with the instinct to survive. The bonds that were forged in a battle held firm even in these darkest of moments. The great Yorktown, which had defied a death just days earlier, now succumbed to the relentless assault. Slowly, steadily, she slipped beneath the waves, the Pacific Ocean reclaiming her as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Her sinking was a somber punctuation mark in the fierce battle, a testament to the high cost of a war. Though the loss of the Yorktown was one of the few bright spots in the Japanese effort during Midway, it did little to diminish the overall turning of the tide in favor of the Allies. The courage of her crew, their tireless efforts to save their ship, and their ultimate sacrifice resonated deeply across the fleet. They were the heroes, their names etched into the memory of a pivotal battle that would change the course of the Pacific War. As the smoke cleared and the waters calmed, the sun reflected off the ocean's surface, now forever marked by the sacrifices that had been made beneath. The battle was far from over, but the sinking of the Yorktown was a poignant reminder of the stakes, where a victory and a loss were measured not just in the ships and the territory, but in the human lives and an unbreakable spirit. The sun dipped slowly beyond the horizon on June 7, 1942, casting the long shadows over the vast Pacific Ocean. Beneath the tranquil waves lay the remnants of one of the most decisive and brutal naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. What had begun as a clash of the titanic naval powers, a desperate gamble by the Japanese Imperial Navy, had ended with a profound loss and the irreversible consequences. But these were not just the statistics or the abstract numbers. They were the stories of the men, the young and the old, who were caught in the merciless tides of a war, their lives extinguished or forever altered in the crucible of a battle. 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Sōryū, and the Hiryū, had been torn from the waters, their hulks shattered by the relentless assault of the American dive bombers. These floating fortresses, the symbols of Japan's naval dominance and an imperial ambition, were now the smoldering wrecks that had sunk into the ocean's depths. With them went over 3,000 of the Japanese souls, the pilots, the sailors, the mechanics, and the officers whose dreams, their hopes, and their futures were swallowed by a fire, a water, and a steel. For Japan, the loss was more than tactical. It was a devastating strategic blow. These carriers had formed the backbone of their Pacific offensive, each one a floating city of the warplanes, the men, and the machines. The destruction of so much of their striking power meant an erosion of their ability to wage the offensive operations for the foreseeable future. The experienced pilots and the crews, many of them irreplaceable, were lost, a wound that was deeper than any sunken ship. On the American side, the cost was severe, but comparatively less crippling. The United States lost the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown and a destroyer, smaller in a scale, but still significant in a sacrifice. 307 of the American servicemen gave their lives in this battle. Each death was a poignant reminder of the fierce contest for the Pacific, where a victory was measured not just in the ships and the territory, but in the human heartbeats that were lost beneath the ocean's surface. The aftermath of Midway was a mosaic of a shattered steel and the shattered souls. The once proud Japanese fleet that had launched the war in the Pacific just 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor now found itself crippled and reeling. Their carefully orchestrated plan to lure the US fleet into a deadly trap had instead turned into a catastrophic defeat. The battle had begun in the cold, dark hours before the dawn on June 4th. The Japanese aircraft had roared over Midway Atoll, dropping the bombs that had shaken the island's foundations. The defenders on Midway, who were armed with the outdated aircraft and the limited resources, had risen to meet the attack with a desperate and a courageous defense. The anti-aircraft guns had roared like a thunder, sending the streaks of the tracer bullets skyward as the pilots had scrambled into their cockpits. Meanwhile, the American torpedo squadrons that had been launched from their carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, had soared into the sky on the near-suicidal missions. Flying low and slow without the protective shield of a fighter cover, these brave men had faced a deadly gauntlet of a Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the enemy fighters. Nearly all of the torpedo bombers had been shot down, and hundreds of the lives had been lost in a minute. Yet, their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing the Japanese fighters down, they had cleared the way for the arriving dive bombers. At the perfect moment, the dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown had struck. In a matter of a minute, the bombs had found their marks on the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Sōryū, turning their decks into the infernos, rupturing their fuel tanks and triggering the chain reactions of the explosions that had doomed the carriers. The fiery destruction was a spectacle of a chaos and a devastation, a turning point that had shattered the Japanese hopes. The Hiryū, the fourth carrier, had launched a desperate counterattack. Her aircraft had hit the Yorktown with a deadly accuracy, inflicting a serious damage and killing many. The carrier that had once seemed to be invincible, that had been rebuilt against all the odds in 72 hours, was crippled again. But the Americans' resolve was unbroken. The dive bombers had returned in the evening, setting the Hiryū ablaze and sealing her fate. The sinking of the Yorktown on June 5th was a poignant moment. Despite her heroic damage control and the tireless work of her crew, the carrier had succumbed to a Japanese submarine's torpedo attack. The ship that had symbolized an American tenacity now rested beneath the waves, joining the long list of the sacrifices. The toll of the battle was not only measured in the ships that were sunk or the planes that were destroyed, but in the lives that were forever changed. The families received the telegrams, the letters from the commanders that were informing them of their loved ones' fates. The mothers, the wives, and the children faced the heart-wrenching void that was left by the husbands, the fathers, and the sons who would never return. The pain echoed from the decks of the sunken carriers to the quiet homes back in America and Japan. Yet amid the sorrow, Midway was a pivotal victory. It marked the first major defeat of the Japanese Navy and shifted the momentum. In the Pacific toward the Allies, the Japanese would never again regain the offensive dominance that they had wielded so effectively. The battle's outcome was a testament to an intelligence, a courage, a sacrifice, and the unpredictable fortunes of a war. The ocean that now concealed the broken ships and the fallen men was a silent witness. It absorbed the echoes of the explosions, the cries of the men, and the hopes that were dashed in a matter of a day. But it also held the promise of a resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of hours, the human spirit endures. As the world moved forward into an uncertain future, the lessons and the losses of Midway resonated. The price that was paid was immense, but the victory paved the way for a relentless Allied advance across the Pacific, an advance that was built on the bravery of those who had fought, the the memory of those who had fallen, and the enduring resolve to secure a freedom on the world's great oceans. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, amid the smouldering wreckage of 4 of Japan's greatest aircraft carriers, lay a far graver and more enduring loss: the death of Japan's elite naval aviators and aircrew. These were not simply numbers on a casualty list. They were the souls of a generation of warriors, skilled beyond measure, whose loss would echo through the rest of the Pacific War like a haunting silence. The battle had not just sunk ships, it had shattered the core of Japan's naval air power. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force was built on the backs of these men, pilots who were trained with a painstaking care, aircrew who were bonded by an experience and a trust, who understood the deadly dance of a carrier warfare like few others in the world. These were the warriors who had taken to the skies with a precision and a daring, who could read the clouds and the enemy's moves as if it were a second nature. But the cost of Midway was catastrophic. More than 200 of Japan's best pilots and aircrew were lost, men who had spent years mastering the complex skills of the carrier takeoffs and the landings, the aerial combat maneuvers, and the bombing tactics. They were the veterans of the countless battles, the backbone of Japan's early successes in the Pacific. Their loss was not something that could be mended by merely sending the fresh recruits to a flight school. Japan's pilot training program was long and rigorous, often taking years to turn the raw recruits into the effective carrier aviators. It was a process that demanded not only a technical skill, but also an experience that was born from an actual combat. The survivors of Midway understood this tragedy deeply, the bitter knowledge that the pool of the seasoned aviators was rapidly drying up. Unlike Japan, the United States had invested heavily in a broader and a more sustainable pilot training system. The American industrial and training machine could turn out the new pilots more rapidly, replacing the losses with the fresh young men who were ready to take their place. The U.S. Navy's ability to replenish its experienced aircrew was a strategic advantage that Japan could not match. In Japan, the loss of these elite airmen was like severing a limb from a great warrior, a weakening, a painful, and an impossible to ignore. The remaining pilots had to carry the heavier burdens, flying more missions with less rest, knowing that their comrades would never return. The impact was both tactical and psychological. For the commanders who were aboard the surviving Japanese ships and in their distant headquarters, the loss posed a dire dilemma. How to rebuild a force that was so finely tuned, so dependent on an experience. How to train the new pilots quickly enough to match the pace of the war without sacrificing the quality of a skill and a cohesion. The answer was painfully clear. They could not. The human cost of Midway went beyond the ships and the planes. It cut to the very heart of Japan's naval aviation. The pilot who had flown that last mission over Midway, the gunner who had never returned to his carrier, the mechanic who had maintained the planes that were now lost at sea. These men were irreplaceable in the ways that went beyond their rank or their role. Each pilot was a story, a son, a husband, a friend who had trained for years, who had endured the grueling physical and the mental trials, and who had faced the deadly chaos of a war with a courage. Their deaths left the gaps in the fabric of their squadrons that no new recruit could instantly fill. The comrades who were left behind felt their absence deeply, a silence amid the roar of the warplanes and the thunder of the guns. The loss also had the strategic consequences. Without enough of the experienced aviators, Japan's ability to conduct the complex carrier operations diminished. A carrier warfare was a precise ballet of a timing, a coordination, and a skill. One misstep could lead to a disaster. The less experienced pilots meant the greater risks, the less effective strikes, and ultimately, a diminished combat effectiveness. For the Japanese Navy's leadership, this was a bitter pill. The Battle of Midway had been conceived as a grand plan to deliver a crippling blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, it had shattered their own naval air power, leaving them with the fewer seasoned pilots and the fewer operational carriers. In the quiet moments after the battle, as the Japanese command reckoned with their losses, the harsh truth settled in. The war in the Pacific had turned. The balance of a power was shifting. America's industrial might, combined with its ability to train and to deploy the pilots at a scale, gave it an advantage that Japan could not simply buy or build overnight. While the Japanese propaganda tried to mask the defeat and to rally the nation's spirit, the reality on the decks of the surviving carriers was grim. The training programs were rushed, and experience was sacrificed for the numbers, and the pilots were sent into a combat with less preparation. The once feared Japanese naval aviators were no longer the unstoppable force they had been in the early months of the war. Meanwhile, the United States Navy celebrated Midway as a turning point, a battle that was won not just by the ships and the planes, but by an intelligence, a bravery, and a resilience. But even the Americans understood the heavy toll. The men who had flown into the battle that day, many of them young and green, had fought with a courage that was forged in a fire and a loss. Their sacrifice had ensured that the tide was turning, but the cost was forever etched into their souls. As the war dragged on, the effects of Japan's irreplaceable loss became more evident. The battles that had once favored the Japanese carrier air groups now tilted towards the Americans. The new pilots, no matter how brave, could not fully replace the knowledge and the instinct that had been honed by the years in the sky. The devastating lessons of Midway had shaped the Pacific War in the ways that no one could have foreseen. The ocean depths off Midway now hold not only the wreckage of the great ships, but the memory of the fallen aviators, the men whose skill and sacrifice had marked a turning point in a history. Their legacy is a reminder of the true cost of a war, not just the machines that were lost, but the lives that were changed and ended, and the fragile human thread that ties the nations to their fate. The sun had barely risen over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean when the reality of what had happened at Midway began to settle in, a reality that would change the course of the war and alter the fate of the nations. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once seemed to be unstoppable, had suffered a defeat so severe that the very fabric of their power was torn apart. The battle was over, but its consequences rippled outward like the shock waves across the ocean, signaling the end of Japan's strategic initiative. From this moment forward, the balance of a power in the Pacific tilted decisively toward the United States. The battle had been fought with a ferocity, a courage, and a heartbreak. 4 of the mighty Japanese carriers, the vessels that had been the heart of Japan's naval strength, lay broken and sunk beneath the waves. Thousands of the experienced men, the finest of the aviators and the sailors that Japan had to offer, were lost in the flames and the depths. The American victory, though it was costly, was a turning point, a moment when the tide of a war had shifted irrevocably. For Japan, Midway was not merely a lost battle, it was the shattering of a dream. The strategic initiative, the power to dictate where, when, and how the battles would be fought in the Pacific, was now lost. Japan could no longer project its dominance with the same confidence. The bold, rapid advances that had carried the Imperial Navy from Pearl Harbor to the shores of Southeast Asia would give way to a defensive posture, a desperate attempt to hold what had been gained. On the other side, the United States that was buoyed by the victory at Midway seized the moment. The war in the Pacific transformed from one of a reactive defense into an aggressive offense. The U.S. Navy, that was energized by the triumph, pushed forward with a relentless determination, launching a series of the island-hopping campaigns that would bring the American forces ever closer to Japan's home islands. But this shift was not merely about the ships and the troops that were moving across the ocean. It was a profound change in a momentum, a morale, and a strategic thinking. The Pacific War, which had seemed to be a dark and an uncertain struggle after Pearl Harbor, now carried a spark of a hope and a purpose. It was a war that would be fought with a new vigor as the United States marshaled its vast industrial might, its growing fleet, and its expanding army to turn the tide. The Japanese leadership faced a grim reality. The loss of the 4 carriers meant the fewer planes to launch the strikes, the fewer pilots with the skill and the experience that were needed to dominate the skies. The once vaunted divine wind of Japan's naval aviation was diminished, and rebuilding that force was a task that was fraught with the impossible odds. The industrial and the training apparatus simply could not replace the lost expertise fast enough. Each subsequent battle would be harder, the gap between the 2 navies widening. Meanwhile, the American industrial output surged. The new carriers rolled off the shipyards. The trained pilots flooded the flight schools, and the innovations in a technology and a tactics accelerated. The U.S. Navy learned from each encounter, improving a coordination between the ships, the planes, and the ground forces. The lessons of Midway, as costly as they were, became the stepping stones toward a victory. The psychological impact of this shift was immense. For the American sailors and the airmen, Midway was a validation of their training, their intelligence efforts, and their courage. It proved that despite being caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, the United States could strike back decisively and win. The victory lifted a morale not only in the military, but across the nation, fueling a determination that would carry through the years of the hard-fought battles. For Japan, the loss was a blow to a national pride and a military confidence. The carefully crafted image of an invincibility was shattered. The question loomed larger than ever: how to recover from such a defeat, and what could be done to regain the initiative that had been lost. The island-hopping campaign that followed was a direct outgrowth of the shift at Midway. Instead of attempting to hold a sprawling empire, the United States focused on capturing the strategic islands, establishing the airfields and the naval bases that would serve as the stepping stones toward Japan itself. Each victory chipped away at Japan's perimeter, forcing it to stretch its resources thin and to defend the multiple fronts. Amidst this vast and complex war, the men who had fought on the decks of the carriers, in the cockpits of the fighter planes, and in the jungles of the distant islands carried the burden of a history on their shoulders. They knew that Midway was a pivot point, a battle that would define the war in their lives. The sacrifices that had been made there were not forgotten. They became a source of an inspiration and a reminder of the cost of a victory. Yet the shift in the Pacific was not instantaneous. Japan still possessed the formidable forces and launched the fierce counterattacks. The battles such as Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf would test the resolve and the strategy of both sides. But the momentum had undeniably changed. The initiative belonged to the United States, and it wielded that power with an increasing confidence. Midway was more than a battle, it was a statement, a declaration that the tide had turned. It marked the beginning of a relentless push by the Allies that would eventually bring a freedom to the Pacific and end the war. But the path ahead was long, hard, and marked by a sacrifice. The ocean, that had once been a vast stage for Japan's dominance, now belonged to a rising power. The sun would set on the Japanese Empire's expansion and rise on America's march to a victory. The shift in the Pacific was not just a military reality, it was a seismic change in the destiny of the nations that was shaped by a courage, an intelligence, and the unyielding will to prevail. As we look back on the Battle of Midway, we see the moment when the balance of a power had changed, when the seeds of a victory were sown, and when the Pacific War had entered a new and a decisive phase. The story is one of a loss and a triumph, of a human bravery and a strategic genius, and above all, a testament to the resilience of those who had fought to shape the future of the world. The war was swirling like a violent storm across the Pacific, a storm of an uncertainty, a fear, and the staggering losses. The fleets clashed, the planes roared overhead, and the lives hung in the balance. Yet amid this chaos, a single figure stood like a lighthouse in the dark, guiding the course of the conflict with the steady hands and a sharp mind. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, embodied a calm in a chaos. His leadership and his decisions shaped the very outcome of the Battle of Midway and ultimately the course of the entire Pacific War. Imagine the weight on Nimitz's shoulders. Just 6 months earlier, the United States had been reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, a devastating blow that had shattered the fleets and the morale alike. The Pacific seemed to be vast and perilous, an ocean of the threats and the unknowns. The Japanese fleet loomed large, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. The pressure was immense. How do you lead a fleet that must confront this overwhelming force? How do you plan when the enemy's moves are shrouded in a secrecy and a deception? How do you keep a hope alive when the stakes are nothing less than a survival? Nimitz was not a man who was given to the rash decisions or the showy gestures. His leadership style was quiet, composed, and rooted in a careful thought and a deep understanding of a naval warfare. He was a man who believed in a preparation, an intelligence, and a trust in his people. But beneath that calm exterior was a fierce determination to protect his country and to turn the tide of a war. As the news of the Japanese plans began to emerge, thanks to the brilliant codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, Nimitz faced a monumental choice. Should he believe the intelligence? Should he risk sending his carriers into what could be a trap? For an admiral, sending his fleet into a harm's way without a certainty was akin to walking a tightrope over a raging sea. But Nimitz trusted his cryptographers, his officers, and his own instincts. He gambled on Midway. This decision was the fulcrum upon which the battle would turn. Nimitz's headquarters was a hive of an activity in those tense days. The maps, the charts, and the reports were spread across the tables as the officers and the analysts worked furiously to piece together the Japanese intentions. Nimitz himself was often found quietly consulting with his trusted aides, weighing the risks and the possibilities. He understood that a victory in the Pacific would depend not just on a firepower, but on a strategy, a foresight, and the willingness to take the calculated risks. His calm demeanor radiated a confidence to those who were under his command. In a war that was filled with an uncertainty, Nimitz was a rock. The sailors and the pilots alike drew a strength from his leadership, knowing that their admiral had a plan, even if that plan carried an enormous risk. Nimitz's strategy was not just about confronting the enemy, it was about understanding the broader picture. Midway Atoll was a tiny speck in the vast Pacific, but Nimitz recognized its significance as a strategic point, an outpost that could either protect Hawaii and the West Coast or fall into the Japanese hands and threaten the entire American defensive line. When the Japanese carriers set out on their mission to capture Midway, Nimitz positioned his forces cleverly. He divided his limited carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to cover the multiple angles, anticipating the Japanese moves with a remarkable precision. His plan was to lie and to wait, to strike decisively when the opportunity arose. But Nimitz was more than a strategist. He was also a master of a delegation and a trust. He empowered his commanders, the men like the admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, to execute the plan with a flexibility and a courage. He knew that a battle was chaotic and unpredictable, and no plan survived a first contact with the enemy. By entrusting the capable leaders with the freedom to adapt, Nimitz created a command structure that was resilient enough to face the storm. The pressure was relentless. Every message, every report, could mean the difference between a victory and a disaster. The admiral's nights were long, filled with the difficult decisions, weighing the lives against the objectives. Yet, he remained composed. His calm was not an ignorance of the stakes, but a mastery of the burden. He knew that a panic or a rashness would doom his forces. As the battle unfolded, Nimitz's trust in an intelligence and in his commanders was vindicated. The American carriers caught the Japanese off guard, striking with a devastating effect. His gamble paid off, turning the tide of the Pacific War. But Nimitz's leadership was not just about the tactics or the strategy, it was about the people, about the men whose lives depended on his decisions. He understood the human cost of a war. He knew that behind every ship's name was a crew, a family, a story. He carried their hopes and their fears with him. One of Nimitz's most poignant qualities was his humility. Despite his pivotal role, he shunned a personal glory. He credited the success of Midway to the bravery of his sailors and his airmen, to the brilliance of the codebreakers, and to the sacrifices that were made on both sides. In his speeches and his correspondence, he spoke of a duty, an honor, and the shared struggle of a nation. Nimitz's leadership in the Battle of Midway set a standard for a command in a wartime, a blend of an intellect, a courage, an empathy, and a calm that inspired those around him to achieve the impossible. His decisions, that were made in the rooms that were far from the front lines, rippled outward to shape a history. Yet, the story does not end with Midway's victory. Nimitz knew that the war was far from over. He prepared for the next battles, the next challenges, understanding that a calm and a chaos was a continuous demand. The battle had shown the power of an intelligence, a planning, and a leadership, but it also underscored the unpredictability and the horror of a war. In the quiet moments after the guns had fallen silent, Nimitz reflected on the price that was paid and the road that was ahead. The calm in a chaos was his gift to a nation at a war, a beacon that was, guiding the fleet through the dark waters toward a hard-fought peace. As the Pacific theater shifted under his steady hand, Admiral Chester Nimitz became more than a military leader. He became a symbol of resilience, a wisdom, and the enduring spirit of those who fight not for a conquest, but for a survival and a freedom. The sky over the vast Pacific was a canvas of a blue that day, calm and endless. But beneath that serene expanse, a storm was brewing, a storm of an ambition, a strategy, and the fatal miscalculations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, stood at the center of this tempest. His mind, that was brilliant and innovative, had brought Japan to the edge of an imperial dominance in the Pacific. But on that fateful day at Midway, the genius of his plan would unravel, revealing the fatal flaw that was buried deep within his grand design. The wounds from this battle would not only mark the Japanese Navy, but they would shadow Yamamoto himself until his own death in 1943. Yamamoto was not just any admiral, he was a man of a vision, an intellect, and a contradiction. Born into a world of a samurai tradition, yet he was educated in the modern ways of a naval warfare. He was a bridge between the eras. He understood the power of an air and a sea like few others of his time. Having studied at Harvard and traveled widely, he foresaw that any future war with the United States would be brutal and long, and he knew that Japan's chances hinged on crippling America's Pacific Fleet before it could fully mobilize. It was this insight that led to his boldest and ultimately his most catastrophic operation, the plan to lure the American fleet into a trap near the tiny island of Midway. It was a plan that was born of a brilliance, but that was burdened by a complexity. To understand Yamamoto's thinking is to understand the high stakes and the immense pressures he faced. Imagine Yamamoto in his war room, surrounded by the charts, the reports, and the maps that were strewn across the table. His face, a mask of a calm concentration, hides a storm of the calculations and the hopes. His plan was audacious, to execute a multi-pronged attack that would simultaneously strike Midway, seize it as a strategic base, and draw the American carriers into a battle where they could be destroyed. The Japanese fleet would strike like a coiled serpent, a precise, an overwhelming, and a final. But here lay the fatal flaw. Yamamoto's plan depended on a perfect timing and a coordination across a vast ocean. It required his fleet to split into the multiple task forces, each one moving on the different courses, communicating under the threat of an enemy detection, all while it was relying on a surprise and a speed. The complexity was immense, like conducting a symphony where each section played the different pieces in the different keys, hoping that the music would somehow harmonize at the climax. The reality of a naval warfare, however, is a chaos, an unpredictable, an unforgiving chaos. A communication was limited, the weather conditions were fickle, and a human error was inevitable. In the vast Pacific, with its endless horizons and its unseen dangers, coordinating such a plan was akin to juggling the knives on a tightrope. And then there was the enemy's secret weapon, the Codebreakers at Station Hypo. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, his carefully concealed plans were being deciphered and decoded by the brilliant American cryptographers who were led by Joseph Rochefort. They had uncovered the true target of the Japanese operation, Midway, that was codenamed AF, and had relayed this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. This gave the Americans the crucial advantage of a foreknowledge, allowing them to prepare an ambush of their own. Yamamoto's grand design began to falter even before the first shot was fired. As the Japanese fleet moved towards Midway, the coordination problems surfaced quickly. His forces, that were scattered and spread thin, struggled to maintain a communication and to synchronize their attacks. Meanwhile, the American carriers lay in a wait, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Yamamoto's plan, that was brilliant on a paper, was collapsing in the reality of a war. The losses at Midway were staggering for Japan. 4 of their 6 carriers were sunk, along with hundreds of the experienced pilots and the crew. The scale of the destruction was so severe that it irreparably weakened the Japanese Navy's offensive capabilities. And at the heart of this catastrophe was the wounded genius, Admiral Yamamoto, his vision shattered, his strategy defeated. Yet, even in a defeat, Yamamoto's character shines through a history. He was a man who was deeply committed to his country, yet who was also aware of the enormous risks he had taken. He had warned Tokyo that a war with the United States would be long and costly, that Japan lacked the industrial capacity to sustain such a conflict indefinitely. His warnings went unheeded by the military establishment and the government officials who were eager for the quick victories. After Midway, Yamamoto continued to command the Japanese naval operations. But the shadow of that battle hung over him. The loss at Midway was not just a strategic defeat, it was a personal wound. Some accounts suggest that Yamamoto felt the weight of a responsibility deeply, haunted by the cost in the lives and the failure of his plan. Yamamoto's story takes a final tragic turn. In April 1943, in a covert American operation that was known as Operation Vengeance, the U.S. forces intercepted and ambushed Yamamoto's plane over the Solomon Islands. The admiral was killed instantly, a casualty of the very intelligence warfare he had helped to inspire. His death was a symbolic blow, the loss of Japan's greatest naval mind. But even in a death, Yamamoto's legacy is complex. He was a visionary who had reshaped a naval warfare, an admiral who had understood the dawn of an air power and the aircraft carriers. Yet, he was also a man whose greatest plan, Midway, was undone by its own complexity and the unyielding realities of a war. The story of Isoroku Yamamoto is a reminder of the thin line between a genius and a hubris, between a brilliance and a failure. It is a story of an ambition and a tragedy, of a leader who had dared to gamble everything on a single move and had paid the ultimate price. As the Pacific War raged on, the wounds of Midway would define the fate of Japan's navy, and the memory of Yamamoto would linger as both a symbol of a strategic brilliance and the cruel costs of a war. The tension in the cramped room was palpable. A single slip, a wrong guess, could cost thousands of the lives, the ships, the planes, the sailors, the entire fleets that were lost to the invisible war of the secrets and the deception. But amid the quiet clatter of the typewriters and the low murmur of the hushed voices, a small group of the men fought a battle that was unlike any other, a battle of the minds against a deadly enemy code. At the heart of this struggle was Joseph Rochefort, a naval officer with a knack for the puzzles and a fierce dedication to his country. His team's success in cracking Japan's secret messages would change the course of the Pacific War. And yet, for the years afterward, their triumph would remain largely unknown, overshadowed by the roar of a cannon and the blaze of a fire. It began with a mystery. The Japanese Navy communicated through the coded messages using a complex cipher system that was known as JN-25. These were not the simple letters or the numbers. This was a tangled web of the symbols that were obscured by the layers of the random keys and the shifting patterns. To break the code was to glimpse the enemy's plans, to see the unseen, to pierce the veil of a war's chaos. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle that changes every day, where every clue is buried beneath the false trails and the deliberate misdirection. This was the world that Rochefort and his team had entered, working the long hours, often late into the night. They combed through the intercepted radio transmissions, looking for the patterns and the irregularities, piecing together the fragments of an information like a shattered mirror. The stakes were enormous. If the Americans could decode just enough of the Japanese messages, they might predict where the next attack would come. They might save the lives, the fleets, the entire nations. But the pressure was intense. The time was short, and a failure meant a disaster. Rochefort was an unconventional leader who was known for his sharp mind, but also for his rebellious streak. He challenged the assumptions and pushed back against a bureaucratic skepticism in the often rigid and hierarchical world of a military intelligence. His willingness to think differently was both a strength and a source of friction. One of the most critical breakthroughs came when Rochefort's team focused on a mysterious code word, AF. The Japanese messages hinted that AF was the target of a major fleet operation, but no one could say with a certainty what it meant. Some feared it might be Midway, a small island with a strategic airbase, but the proof was elusive. To confirm their suspicions, Rochefort devised a clever ruse. He ordered Midway's radio operators to send an unencrypted message that their water purification system had broken down. Shortly afterward, the American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese transmission that was reporting that AF was short of water. This clever test confirmed beyond a doubt that AF referred to Midway. This moment was a turning point. With the target identified, Admiral Nimitz could prepare his forces for an ambush, setting the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. But while Rochefort and his team's work was crucial, it remained hidden behind the layers of secrecy. Despite their success, Rochefort and his colleagues were not the celebrated heroes. The intelligence community was secretive, and much of their work remained classified for the decades. Worse, the internal rivalries and the bureaucratic politics sometimes sidelined Rochefort, who faced a suspicion and a criticism from the higher-ups. His maverick style clashed with the more traditional naval officers, and he was even removed from his command shortly after Midway. Yet, the impact of Rochefort's code-breaking was undeniable. By unraveling Japan's secrets, he gave the U.S. Navy the priceless gift of a foresight, allowing them to anticipate the attacks, to conserve the resources, and to strike back with a deadly precision. The human element of this story is striking. The codebreakers were not the glamorous warriors on the front lines. They were the quiet, often overlooked figures who were working in the dim rooms that were filled with the hum of the radios and the scratch of the pencils, bearing the burden of an invisible war. Many were young, brilliant, and underpaid, driven not by a glory, but by a fierce commitment to their country and to each other. Their story is one of a perseverance, an intellect, and a courage. The courage to challenge an authority, to believe in the unseen patterns, and to carry the weight of the lives that were resting on every decoded word. As the Battle of Midway unfolded, Rochefort's intelligence proved to be indispensable. The American commanders relied on the decoded messages to position their ships and their aircraft perfectly, to launch the strikes at precisely the right moment. The ambush that followed was a stunning success, turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. But the story of the codebreakers does not end there. After the war, many of them faded into an obscurity, their contributions overshadowed by the dramatic battles at the sea and in the air. A recognition was slow, and the secrecy that was surrounding an intelligence work meant that their vital role was only acknowledged the years later, as the historians pieced together the hidden layers of the conflict. The tale of Joseph Rochefort and his team is a powerful reminder that the wars are won not only by the guns and the bombs, but also by the minds and the courage behind the scenes. Their quiet victories shaped a history, changing the fate of the nations and redefining the art of a warfare. As we reflect on Midway, we must remember the men in those shadowy rooms who were decoding, who were analyzing, and who were fighting a secret battle that saved the countless lives and changed the course of the Pacific War forever. A sudden roar split the early morning air, a squadron of the tiny planes, their engines screaming like the very cries of a fate. They surged upward, leaving behind the fragile safety of their carriers into a sky that was thick with a smoke, a fire, and a death. These were not the ordinary flights. These were the missions that were born in a desperation, a courage, and a fierce will to fight against the overwhelming odds. The men in those cockpits knew, some whispered it aloud, that many would never see the sun set again. They were flying into a hell. The Battle of Midway was a crucible that forged the heroes from the ordinary men. In the cramped cockpits that were exposed to the fury of an anti-aircraft fire and the deadly speed of the enemy fighters, the U.S. pilots faced a terrifying choice every time they took off, to fight with every ounce of a strength or to fall silent in the ocean's cold embrace. Picture this: a torpedo bomber that is slow and cumbersome is lumbering toward a fleet of the sleek armored warships that are bristling with the guns. It is like sending a sparrow to challenge a hawk. There was no fighter escort to shield them, no safety net, just the roar of the engines, the jolt of the launch, and the terrifying knowledge that the sky itself was an enemy. These men, the pilots, the bombardiers, the navigators, were more than just the soldiers. They were the ordinary Americans who were young and full of a hope, who were thrown into an extraordinary moment. Their faces, that were etched with a determination and a fear, told the stories of a quiet heroism. The faces like Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who floated alone amidst the wreckage, watching his comrades vanish one by one, or Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led his squadron with an unshakable resolve into an almost certain death. The planes they flew were the machines of a fragile metal and a fragile hope. The Douglas TBD Devastators, that were often outdated and outmatched, lumbered toward the enemy like the knights who were charging with the wooden swords against a steel. Their torpedoes, that were essentially the underwater missiles, were the best hope to pierce the thick armor of the Japanese carriers. But their slow speed and the danger of an exposure made each attack a suicide mission. The pilots knew the odds. They knew the danger. Yet, they soared anyway. On June 4th, as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, the waves of the torpedo bombers launched from the USS Enterprise, the Yorktown and the Hornet. They flew low, skimming over the ocean's surface toward the Japanese fleet. The enemy's anti-aircraft guns opened up like the thunderclaps, peppering the sky with a flak, the exploding shells that were designed to shred the planes in mid-air. The screech of the bullets, the sharp stings of a shrapnel, the roar of the engines that were pushed to the edge, all became the soundtrack of their final journey. Many never reached their targets. Many were shot down before they could even release their torpedoes. The others crashed into the sea or vanished without a trace. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Their attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, disrupting their flight decks and diverting their fighter planes. This chaos created the fleeting window that the American dive bombers needed to strike. And strike they did. In the aftermath, the sea was littered with the wreckage and the bodies, the planes that were twisted like a paper, the men who were struggling in the water, clutching to the life rafts or the flotsam. The rescue crews risked everything to pull the survivors from the depths, but many were lost to the unforgiving ocean. The human stories here are staggering in their depth. The men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the dive bombers with a razor-sharp precision, who was guided by a sheer instinct and a desperate desire to avenge his fallen comrades, or the pilots like Lieutenant Richard Best, whose calm focus amidst the chaos allowed him to deliver the devastating blows to the enemy ships. Their acts of valor were tinged with a heartbreak. Every victory was paid for with a loss, the brothers in arms who would never return home, whose dreams were cut short in the swirl of a smoke and a fire. Imagine the families who were waiting back in America, who were receiving the telegrams that spoke in the cold, clipped words, missing in an action, killed in a service. The faces behind those words were the real people with the hopes and the fears, the sons and the husbands whose names echoed across the ocean. Yet, despite the overwhelming danger, these men flew on. They carried the weight of a nation's hope on their shoulders, their courage shining like the beacons in the darkest of skies. The pilots' courage was not born from a reckless desire for a glory, but from a deep sense of a duty and a love for their country. They understood that the battle for Midway was more than just a fight for an island. It was a fight for the future, for a freedom, for the chance that their loved ones might live in a world that was free from a tyranny. As the torpedo squadrons soared into the storm of an enemy fire, their stories became the legends, not just of a war, but of the human spirit's capacity to confront a fear, a sacrifice, and the unknown. Their sacrifice paved the way for a victory, their bravery echoing through a history. Yet for the years, many of these heroes remained unnamed, their deeds overshadowed by the larger narrative of the battle. This chapter of Midway is a testament to their courage, a reminder that behind every statistic, behind every ship that was sunk or saved, were the men who had faced a hell and had dared to fly. As the sun climbed higher on that fateful June day, these pilots became the heart of a turning tide, their sacrifice lighting the path toward a hard-won victory and a new chapter in the Pacific War. But the story does not end here. The skies above Midway would soon witness the even fiercer battles, the more daring missions, and the tragic losses, with each moment shaping the course of a history, one flight at a time. The ocean trembled with the echoes of the explosions, the steel giants that were burning and sinking beneath the waves. The sky, that was once clear and blue, now hung heavy with a smoke, a fire, and the ghosts of a brutal battle. 4 of the mighty Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Sōryū, and the Hiryū, had been reduced to the smouldering hulks, their decks shattered, their crews lost to the sea. It was a defeat so profound, so total, that it changed the very course of a naval warfare forever. This was Midway, the moment when the era of the battleship came to an abrupt, fiery end, and the aircraft carrier took its rightful place as the queen of the seas. For the centuries, a naval power had been measured by the might of the battleships, the massive, heavily armored ships that were bristling with the giant guns that were capable of firing the explosive shells for the miles across the horizon. These steel behemoths were the symbols of a national pride and a military strength, the ultimate war machines. But at Midway, the battleship was revealed as a relic, outmatched and outmaneuvered by a new force, the aircraft carrier, a floating airbase that could strike far beyond the reach of any gun. The battle was not just about the ships and the planes. It was a clash of the naval philosophies, a test of whether a speed, a surprise, and the reach of the sky could overcome the brute strength of an armor and a firepower. And in this test, the carriers emerged victorious. Imagine a chessboard that is spread across the vast Pacific Ocean, with the fleets that are maneuvering like the pieces, each one waiting for the perfect move. The Japanese fleet, that was confident and aggressive, believed that their mighty battleships and their carriers could crush the American defenders. But the Americans, who were led by the visionaries like Admiral Chester Nimitz, had wagered everything on the carrier's unique power, the ability to launch the air strikes from the hundreds of miles away, unseen and untouchable until the bombs fell. This shift was more than technical. It was a revolution in a naval strategy. The carriers were not just the ships, they were the launch pads for the aerial warriors, the planes that could scout, attack, and defend across the endless blue. They changed how the wars were fought at the sea, turning the battles into the skyward duels of a speed, a precision, and a nerve. The pilots who had taken off from those decks, the young men like Wade McCluskey, Max Leslie, and George Gay, became the new frontline soldiers, their courage and their skill transforming the carrier from a mere ship into a weapon of an unmatched power. At Midway, the carriers demonstrated their lethal potential. The Japanese carriers that were caught off guard by the American dive bombers were vulnerable. They had to stop launching their planes, to slow down, and to attempt to fight back. Their decks became the blazing infernos. Meanwhile, the American carriers, though they were fewer in a number, had positioned themselves wisely, their planes ready to strike at the critical moment. The destruction of the 4 Japanese carriers marked the first time in a history that so many carriers were lost in a single battle, a staggering blow that Japan never fully recovered from. On the American side, the loss of the USS Yorktown was deeply felt. It was a harsh reminder that the carrier era was still in its infancy, still learning the hard lessons in a vulnerability and an endurance. But the Yorktown sacrifice underscored the immense risks and the stakes that were involved in a carrier warfare. Midway proved that the battleships could no longer command the seas alone. They were slow, with a limited range, and vulnerable to the air attacks. The carriers, with their mobility and their reach, redefined a naval dominance. From that point forward, the naval battles would be won or lost in the skies above, not on the decks below. The shift was also cultural. The naval officers had to rethink everything, from the tactics to the training to a ship design. The aircraft carrier operations required a coordination between the pilots, the mechanics, the deck crews, and the commanders. A complex dance under an immense pressure. The successful execution of these operations at Midway was a testament to an American innovation and a determination. But this transition was not without a cost. The men who were aboard those carriers, the pilots, the sailors, the mechanics, faced the new kinds of a danger. The carrier battles were fast, chaotic, and brutal. One mistake could ignite a chain reaction of the explosions. The lives hung in the balance with every takeoff and a landing, every mission. The human stories behind the machines reveal the full weight of this new era, the aircrew's courage, the deck crew's precision, the commander's decisions, all of them intertwined in a high-stakes gamble with the fate of the nations. As the sun set on the burning decks of the Japanese carriers, a new dawn rose for a naval warfare. Midway was more than a battle, it was a transformation, a turning point that set the stage for the relentless push of the Allied forces across the Pacific. The carriers became the symbols of a hope and a power, the floating islands of a resilience that could project a force across the vast oceans. They allowed the United States to go on the offensive, turning the tide of the war and ultimately shaping the modern naval battlefield. Yet, the full impact of Midway's lessons took a time to unfold. The carriers would continue to evolve, growing larger and more sophisticated, while the lessons that were learned from Midway's victories and its losses informed the future battles, Leyte Gulf, the Philippine Sea, and beyond. Midway confirmed that a control of the skies was the key to controlling the seas. It shattered the old myths and ushered in a new age where an air power ruled the waves, where the planes became the decisive factor in a naval dominance. And in the hearts of those who had fought and had survived, Midway was a testament to an adaptability, a courage, and the relentless human spirit to innovate against all the odds. But even as the carriers reigned supreme, the battle for the Pacific was far from over. The ocean remained vast and treacherous, and the war would demand the even greater sacrifices, the sharper strategies, and an unyielding resolve. Midway was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was written in the roar of the aircraft engines and the flash of an aerial combat, a chapter where the sky was no longer the limit, but the battlefield itself. The question lingered: could this new era withstand the brutal tests of a war? And could the men who had flown these iron birds continue to meet the challenges that were ahead? As the tides of a war had shifted, the story of Midway and the birth of the carrier era remained a beacon, an enduring reminder that in a war, as in a life, the ability to adapt and to rise above often decides who wins and who falls. The ocean was thick with a smoke and a fire. The horizon was blurred by the deafening roar of the explosions. The skies were darkened not only by the burning wreckage of the ships, but by the weight of a devastating truth. What if Midway had ended differently? What if the Japanese fleet, with its overwhelming might and its tactical brilliance, had succeeded in sinking all three of the American carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the barely repaired Yorktown, and had seized Midway Island itself? This is the question that haunts the echoes of a history, a chilling what-if that reshapes the entire narrative of World War II in the Pacific. Imagine for a moment the American carriers, the last bulwarks of a U.S. naval power in the Pacific, that were swallowed by a fire under water. Imagine the strategic jewel of Midway that was lost to the rising sun's banner, its airstrips and its defenses that were overrun. The Japanese Navy, that was unopposed, was tightening its grip on the Pacific, ready to push further into the vast ocean and beyond. What would the world have looked like then? What horrors and what hardships might have unfolded if the scales had tipped in favor of Japan on that fateful June day in 1942? The sinking of the three U.S. carriers would have been a catastrophic blow, not just tactically, but psychologically, to the United States. These were not the mere ships, they were the symbols of a hope, a resilience, and the very heart of an American naval strength. Their loss would have echoed like a death knell across the country, shaking the confidence of a nation that was still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior. Without the carriers, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been crippled. The vast stretches of the ocean that had been contested fiercely might have become an unchallenged Japanese territory. The Imperial Navy, that was flushed with a victory, could have threatened Hawaii itself, possibly isolating the American West Coast from its Pacific allies and its resources. Midway, that was strategically positioned at the heart of the Pacific, was far more than a speck of a land. It was a shield that was protecting the Hawaiian Islands, a forward base for a reconnaissance, a refueling, and a launching of the attacks. Its capture would have placed the Japanese within a striking distance of Hawaii and the U.S. mainland, a frightening prospect for a nation that was grappling with a war on the multiple fronts. In this scenario, Japan's ability to control the Pacific would have been near absolute. Their supply lines would have been secured, their advance would have been unchecked. They could have pressed their advantage further into the Indian Ocean, threatening the British colonies and disrupting the Allied supply routes that were crucial for the war effort in Europe and Asia. The US might have been forced into a defensive posture, retreating to regroup, to rebuild, and to rethink its Pacific strategy. The war could have stretched for longer, it could have been bloodier, and it could have been more uncertain. But the consequences reached beyond a military strategy. The morale of both nations would have shifted drastically. Japan's victory could have emboldened its leadership, increasing their appetite for an expansion and potentially prolonging their hold on the occupied territories, intensifying a suffering for the millions who were caught in the conflict. On the American home front, the shock might have led to a crisis of a faith in a leadership and the war effort. The call to arms, so vital to mobilize the millions of the Americans, could have faltered under the shadow of such a crushing defeat. Yet, even in this dark, alternate reality, the human spirit that is stubborn and resilient would have continued to fight. The same courage that had defined the torpedo squadrons and the dive bombers at Midway, the same grit that had carried the men through the years of a war, would not have faded. But how different would a history have been? Today, a gentle wind whispers over the coral formations. The surf kisses the shoreline where the clamor of airplane engines and the blast of bombs once filled the air. Midway Atoll, formerly a furnace of conflict, a combat zone where men battled and perished in a lethal ballet of bravery and flame, now exists in silence, remade. Here, where the narrative of June 1942 was written in fire, the natural world has started to reassert its sovereignty. The island, scarred by the conflict, has transformed into a haven for wildlife, a living monument that safeguards the memory of sacrifice and the delicate beauty of tranquility. Picture a stroll on these beaches. Underfoot, the phantoms of long-ago battles seem to awaken. The corroded remnants of bunkers and defensive works stand like ancient guardians, keeping watch over the present. The atmosphere holds a quiet solemnity, a sense of reverence that stems from the awareness of what occurred here, the bloodshed, the valor, and the crucial turning point that shifted the trajectory of a global war. Midway Atoll in the present is a far cry from the hellish furnace it once was. The deep bomb craters have been smoothed by time, filled with ocean water and teeming with life. The once-scorched runways now serve as nesting grounds for birds, and the once active radio towers are now quiet. It is a location of stark juxtaposition, the lasting wounds of war set against the flourishing, vibrant wildlife that has made this distant atoll its sanctuary. The United States has meticulously safeguarded this hallowed ground, designating it as a national wildlife refuge and a historical landmark. This action is a powerful expression of profound respect for history and an acknowledgement of the island's unique identity as both a battlefield and a sanctuary. While walking here, one can see the renowned Laysan albatrosses, their wings spread wide against the breeze as they soar with ease over the turquoise sea. These birds, often nicknamed Goonie birds by mariners, have discovered a safe harbor on Midway's secluded shores, protected from both predators and human interference. Their nesting areas cover the island, creating a stunning display of life enduring where so much destruction once occurred. Beneath the waves, rich coral reefs are alive with a multitude of colorful fish and marine life. The atoll is a treasure of biodiversity, a living research station for scientists and environmentalists committed to comprehending and safeguarding the fragile equilibrium of marine ecosystems. Yet, within this splendor lies the persistent memory of the men who fought on this ground, pilots who ventured into impossible situations, sailors who operated artillery under ceaseless attack, and Marines who held their positions against superior forces. The island's monuments commemorate their sacrifices with inscribed stone and plaques that recount tales of bravery, bereavement, and the aspiration that from destruction, renewal may emerge. A visit to Midway today is an excursion through history. The oxidized relics of wartime machinery are half swallowed by sand and coral, silent observers of the battle's ferocity. These artifacts serve as a reminder that beneath the calm facade of peace is the price of liberty, the lives sacrificed, the choices made in moments of incredible duress. The historical locations are painstakingly preserved, with guided tours led by rangers that give visitors an opportunity to engage with the past. Photographs and personal letters from those who served here add a human dimension to the battle, changing remote history into personal tales of affection, apprehension, resolve, and optimism. But Midway is not simply a historical exhibit, it is a representation of resilience. The island itself, damaged by conflict and the elements, has recuperated over the years, serving as a metaphor for humanity's ability to bounce back from its most tragic episodes. Its fauna thrives, a signal that life can prevail even in the wake of devastation. The atoll also functions as an essential hub for scientific inquiry, especially for studying the impacts of climate change and human actions on oceanic environments. Its isolated position provides a pure setting for observing marine life and coral vitality, making it a crucial location for worldwide conservation initiatives. However, the narrative of Midway is not solely about the natural world or historical events. It is about remembrance. It concerns the duty we have to recall the sacrifices made on these shores, to honor the valor of those who fought, and to make sure that the lessons of war are not consigned to oblivion. Every year, veterans and their families make their way back to Midway, their steps retracing the roots of those who were there before them. Commemorative ceremonies are held on anniversaries, where voices join in song and reflection, the quiet broken by narratives passed from one generation to the following. The atoll, despite its remoteness and isolation, links all of us to a crucial point in history, a time when bravery, sacrifice, and resolve altered the course of war and molded the contemporary world. Walking in the shadow of corroded artillery and near the vestiges of old bunkers, visitors can feel the gravity of history resting lightly on their shoulders. It is a serious reminder that tranquility is delicate, that liberty is secured through sacrifice, and that memory serves as the conduit between what was and what will be. Midway's metamorphosis from a battleground into a sanctuary is a testament to the enduring nature of the human spirit, a dedication to preserve, to mend, and to honor. But even as the natural world prospers and memories persist, the island confronts new threats. Increasing sea levels, climate change, and human-caused impacts jeopardize this delicate ecosystem, reflecting the continuous battle to safeguard the legacies we cherish. The story of Midway Atoll today is one of stark contrasts, the brutal facts of war and the gentle resilience of life, the past engraved in stone and rust, and the present vibrant with birdsong and the sound of ocean waves. As the sun goes down over the Pacific, bathing the atoll's peaceful shores in a golden glow, the spirits of Midway murmur their tales. Into the wind, stories of sacrifice, bravery, and hope that continue to resonate, urging us to remember, to learn, and to protect. For Midway is not merely a location on a chart. It is a living memory, a haven for life, and a symbol of what humanity can withstand and surmount. And for as long as the waves break on its shores, for as long as the albatross glides above, Midway will endure, silent, solemn, and eternal. The heavens over the immense Pacific on that day were a tableau of turmoil. Detonations tore through the clouds. Warplanes shrieked like spectral figures, and beneath them, the agitated sea boiled with the violence of men and machinery locked in a mortal combat. Midway, a minuscule point in the ocean, yet on June 4, 1942, it became the setting for a conflict unlike any other, a battle that would reverberate through the annals of time, determining the destiny of nations and altering the trajectory of a war that had spread across the planet. At the core of this monumental struggle was an intersection of bravery, strategy, and perfect timing, a flawless confluence of human determination and calculated gambles. This was no conventional engagement. It was a contest of intellect and fortitude, of sacrifices made in obscurity and decisions executed in fractions of a second. The Battle of Midway is still regarded as one of the most significant naval victories ever achieved, not just for the vessels sunk or the lives lost, but for the dramatic shift it created in the strategic balance across the Pacific. To grasp why Midway holds such a unique place, we must first look past the roar of cannons and the smoke from burning carriers. We must see the faces behind the flight helmets, the young pilots gripping their controls with unsteady hands, the sailors at their posts amidst the deafening sound of anti-aircraft guns, the codebreakers in shadowed rooms assembling fragments of enemy intelligence. Each person played a role in a grand design woven with the threads of courage, sacrifice, and unadulterated human will. Consider the tension in the moments leading up to the battle. The Americans, under the leadership of Admiral Chester Nimitz, were in a precarious position. They were aware that the Japanese were approaching, but the enemy's intentions were shrouded in secrecy, concealed behind intricate codes and clever misdirection. Yet, through the relentless efforts of cryptographers like Joseph Rochefort, the curtain was pulled back just enough to pinpoint the real objective, Midway itself. Nimitz's decision to lay a trap for the Japanese fleet was an act of profound confidence in his intelligence, in his leaders, and in the spirit of his men. It was akin to positioning a single chess piece correctly, in the hope that it would put a far more powerful opponent in checkmate. But in warfare, fortune is a fickle ally. The success of such a strategy hinged on timing, the exact moment to attack when the adversary was most vulnerable and undefended. The Japanese, commanded by Admiral Yamamoto, had devised an ambitious plan. Their aim was to bait the American fleet into a trap, obliterate their carriers, and establish their dominance over the Pacific. They were self-assured, their veterans were battle-tested, and their equipment was superior, or so it was thought. But war is frequently a clash of unexpected factors. At Midway, the momentum would shift against them, not solely because of technology or numbers, but due to human bravery and the chaotic nature of battle. Imagine the torpedo squadrons, small formations of biplanes and torpedo bombers flying without fighter protection into a deluge of enemy fire. Their aircraft were slow, exposed, and outmatched. Yet, they advanced, flying directly into the Japanese defenses, with many fated never to return. Their sacrifice was not futile. By luring the enemy's fighters down and disrupting their defensive screen, they created the vital opening that the dive bombers required. It was a somber, high-stakes maneuver, a tale of heroism written in the sky with blood. When the dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown made their appearance, their assault was catastrophic. In a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's formidable carriers were engulfed in flames, their decks destroyed, their crews fighting for their lives. The shock was profound. It was a moment that altered the strategic balance of the Pacific, leaving the Japanese Navy in a state of disarray. But the battle was far from finished. The Hiryū, the last of the 4 carriers, launched a fierce counterattack that inflicted severe damage on the Yorktown. The chaos was unceasing. Fires blazed, alarms sounded, and men struggled desperately against ever-increasing odds. The sight of burning ships and columns of smoke was a stark reminder that victory always comes at a high price. And yet, despite the damage to the Yorktown, the Americans did not lose their hope or their composure. Damage control crews worked with a feverish intensity, mending holes, combating floods, and keeping the carrier operational just long enough to continue the fight. The resilience displayed on that battered deck was a symbol of the entire battle, a refusal to surrender even when the situation seemed hopeless. The Japanese losses were staggering: 4 carriers sunk, countless aircraft destroyed, and over 3,000 men killed. But beyond the statistics, the real blow was the loss of experienced pilots and crew, an irreplaceable human asset that the Japanese Navy would find it difficult to replenish. This loss of manpower struck at the very core of Japan's naval air power, changing the direction of the war. On the American side, the loss of the Yorktown and a destroyer, along with 307 lives, was a heavy blow. Yet, the victory at Midway was a beacon of hope, a demonstration that courage, combined with intelligence and timing, could triumph over even the most powerful of adversaries. The legacy of the battle is also a story of leadership. Admiral Nimitz, calm and determined, led his forces with a steady hand. His trust in his men and in the meticulous work of his intelligence officers was instrumental in the outcome. And beyond the generals, the pilots, sailors, and marines who confronted unimaginable danger and uncertainty were the embodiment of the spirit of sacrifice and resolve. Midway was not simply a battle fought with steel and fire, it was a test of character where ordinary men performed extraordinary feats. It is a story of split-second choices, of trust built in the face of adversity, and of a nation's determination to protect its freedom. Today, historians continue to analyze Midway, extracting lessons about strategy, intelligence, and human bravery. It stands as a pivotal moment in naval history, a testament to how information, timing, and courage can converge to alter the course of history. The battle also serves as a potent reminder of the cost of war, the lives permanently changed, the families left behind, and the shadows that remain long after the guns have gone silent. Midway teaches us that victory is never without cost, and that the price is paid by real people with hopes, fears, and dreams. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the echoes of Midway remind us that history is alive in our memory, that courage can indeed change the tide, and that the smallest of islands can be the setting for the greatest of stories. It is a battle for the ages, not just for its tactical brilliance or its place in military history, but for the human spirit that shone brightly amidst the smoke and fire. In the final analysis, Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a symbol, a testament. It was proof that in the darkest of times, courage and conviction can light the way forward. And as the waves wash over the atoll, carrying the whispers of those who fought and fell, the story of Midway lives on, timeless, powerful, and eternal. In the quiet aftermath of Midway's fury, as the world reckoned with a battle that had reshaped the Pacific, One name echoed with a solemn reverence: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was not just a commander, he was the architect of Japan's grand strategy, a man whose brilliance had brought his nation to the brink of an empire, and whose fatal miscalculation had now set it on a path toward ruin. The story of Yamamoto is a tale of a wounded genius, a leader who understood his enemy perhaps too well, and who was ultimately consumed by the very war he had so reluctantly unleashed. Yamamoto was a man of contradictions. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had seen America's industrial might firsthand, its sprawling factories, its vast resources, its resilient people. This knowledge filled him with a deep and prophetic dread. He repeatedly warned his superiors in Tokyo that a prolonged war with the United States would be a disaster for Japan. "I shall run wild for 6 months or a year," he famously predicted, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." Yet, when his nation chose the path of war, Yamamoto, bound by duty and honor, set about designing a strategy to win it. His plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor was a stroke of audacious brilliance, a perfectly executed surprise attack designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy Japan the time it needed to secure its new empire. The plan for Midway was intended to be the final decisive blow, the masterstroke that would force a demoralized America to the negotiating table. It was a strategy born of a deep understanding of naval air power, a concept he had championed long before many of his contemporaries. But Yamamoto's genius was also his flaw. His plan for Midway was a masterpiece of complexity, a delicate and intricate web of deception and maneuver involving multiple fleets spread across thousands of miles of ocean. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect intelligence, and a perfect underestimation of his enemy. It was a plan that left no room for the chaos, the luck, and the sheer human grit that so often define the reality of battle. When the plan unraveled, it did so catastrophically. The loss of 4 of his best aircraft carriers and hundreds of his most experienced pilots at Midway was a wound from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. For Yamamoto, it was a personal and professional devastation. He had gambled everything on a single brilliant roll of the dice, and he had lost. The reports of the battle left him in a state of stunned shock, and he reportedly spent days in seclusion, grappling with the scale of the defeat. In the months that followed, Yamamoto continued to lead the Japanese fleet, but the shadow of Midway hung over him. He oversaw the brutal campaign in the Solomon Islands, a grinding war of attrition that further bled his already weakened naval air forces. He was still a formidable opponent, but the boundless confidence of the early war years was gone, replaced by a grim and weary determination. His end came in April 1943, a direct consequence of the same American intelligence breakthrough that had doomed him at Midway. The codebreakers of Station Hypo, having learned of his planned inspection tour of the Solomon Islands, intercepted his flight itinerary. In a daring long-range ambush known as Operation Vengeance, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport plane and shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor was killed, his death a stunning blow to Japanese morale. The story of Isoroku Yamamoto is a profound and tragic one. He was a brilliant strategist, a visionary who understood the future of naval warfare, and a man who foresaw the ultimate futility of the war he was tasked to win. He was a wounded genius, a patriot trapped by the currents of history, his legacy forever defined by the brilliant victory that began the war and the catastrophic defeat that sealed its fate. The fate of an empire can turn on a single decision, a single moment of hesitation in the heart of a storm. On the morning of June 4, 1942, aboard the flagship Akagi, that moment belonged to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He was the commander of the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, the powerful carrier strike force that had laid waste to Pearl Harbor and had, until this day, seemed invincible. But at Midway, faced with a series of unexpected and contradictory reports, Nagumo hesitated. And in that hesitation, he lost the battle, the war, and his place in history. The morning had begun with a successful, though not decisive, airstrike on Midway Island. His planes had inflicted heavy damage, but the island's airfield was still operational. As his first wave of aircraft was returning, Nagumo received a series of confusing reports. First, a scout plane reported sighting American ships, but their type was uncertain. Then came the relentless, though ineffective, attacks from Midway's land-based bombers. Then, most critically, came the suicidal attacks of the American torpedo squadrons. Nagumo was now faced with a terrible dilemma. His returning planes from the Midway strike needed to land, refuel, and rearm. His reserve aircraft on the hangar decks were armed with bombs, prepared for a second strike on the island to finish the job. But the report of American ships, possibly carriers, demanded a different response. His planes needed to be rearmed with torpedoes to attack the enemy fleet. To do so would be a time-consuming and dangerous process, leaving his flight decks cluttered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines at the most vulnerable moment. What should he do? Attack the island again, or prepare for the enemy fleet? Nagumo hesitated. He chose to wait for a clearer picture, to land his returning planes first, and then to rearm for an attack on the American ships. It was a logical, prudent decision. It was also a fatal one. That decision, made in a window of just a few crucial minutes, created a scene of incredible chaos and vulnerability on the decks of the Japanese carriers. Bombs were being brought up from the magazines while torpedoes were being taken down. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks, and the returning planes, along with the reserve fighters, were being shuffled around. The Japanese carriers, for a brief, critical moment, were floating powder kegs, their flight decks a tangled mess, their combat air patrol of Zero fighters drawn down to low altitude to deal with the torpedo bombers. It was in this exact moment of maximum vulnerability that the American dive bombers, led by Wade McCluskey, arrived, unseen, from high above. Nagumo's hesitation had cost him everything. The American attack was a devastating success, turning 3 of his 4 carriers into blazing infernos in a matter of minutes. Nagumo himself barely escaped the burning bridge of the Akagi, his spirit shattered by the sudden and catastrophic turn of events. The story of Nagumo's dilemma is a classic case study in the fog of war, the confusion and uncertainty that can paralyze a commander in the heat of battle. He was a capable and experienced admiral, but he was also a cautious man, a product of a naval tradition that valued methodical planning over improvisation. At Midway, faced with a situation that his doctrine had not prepared him for, his caution became his undoing. He has been heavily criticized by historians for his fatal hesitation, but it is a criticism made with the perfect clarity of hindsight. In that moment, with incomplete information and immense pressure, his decision was an understandable, though tragic, one. There are moments in the history of warfare where courage transcends strategy, where sacrifice becomes a victory in itself. The story of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the USS Hornet at the Battle of Midway is one such moment. It is a tale of almost unbelievable bravery, a suicidal charge into the face of certain death that, in its very failure, helped to pave the way for one of America's greatest victories. The men of VT-8 flew the Douglas TBD Devastator, an aircraft that was, by 1942, tragically obsolete. It was slow, underpowered, and poorly armored. Its torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. To fly a Devastator against the modern defenses of a Japanese carrier fleet was a death sentence, and every man in the squadron knew it. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a man of intense, almost fanatical determination. On the morning of June 4th, he gathered his men for a final briefing. He knew the odds were impossible. He told them that if only one plane was left, he wanted that plane to go in and get a hit. He had a premonition of his own death, and he left a final, poignant letter for his wife. When the Hornet's air group took off, they became separated in the clouds. The fighters and dive bombers turned one way. Waldron, convinced the enemy was in a different location, broke formation and led his 15 Devastators on a different course. He was right. He found the Japanese fleet. But he was also alone, with no fighter cover. What followed was a slaughter. The 15 planes of VT-8 descended to low altitude to begin their torpedo runs. They were met by a storm of anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ships and a swarm of nimble, deadly Zero fighters. The slow-moving Devastators were easy targets. One by one, they were shot down, exploding in mid-air or crashing into the sea in a plume of fire and water. They pressed their attack with a courage that stunned even the Japanese pilots who were killing them. Not a single plane wavered. They flew straight and steady into the teeth of the enemy until the last plane was gone. Of the 30 men in the squadron, only one survived. Ensign George H. Gay Jr. was wounded, and his plane was shot down, but he managed to escape the sinking wreck and cling to a floating seat cushion. For the next 30 hours, he would be a spectator to history, hiding under his cushion to avoid being strafed, watching as the rest of the battle unfolded around him. He saw the American dive bombers arrive and turn the Japanese carriers into infernos. He was a witness to the victory that his squadron had died to make possible. Torpedo Squadron 8 did not score a single hit. Every one of their torpedoes missed or failed to explode. In tactical terms, their attack was a complete failure. But in strategic terms, their sacrifice was invaluable. Their relentless suicidal charge drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies at high altitude wide open. And their attack, along with those of the torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, forced the Japanese carriers to engage in evasive maneuvers, preventing them from launching their own counterstrike. They were the sacrificial lambs, the men who died so that others might succeed. Their story is one of the most heroic and heartbreaking of the entire war. The Battle of Midway was a battle of minutes, of moments, of single decisions that could alter the course of history, and no decision was more critical than the one made in the cockpit of a dauntless dive bomber, high above the Pacific, by a man who was lost, low on fuel, and on the verge of turning back. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, the commander of the USS Enterprise's air group, was the man who, through a combination of sheer luck, stubborn determination, and brilliant instinct, found the Japanese fleet and led the attack that would change the world. On the morning of June 4th, McCluskey led his squadron of 32 SBD dauntless dive bombers off the deck of the Enterprise. Their mission was to find and destroy the Japanese carriers. They flew to the predicted location of the enemy, but found only empty ocean. The Japanese fleet was not where it was supposed to be. For a commander leading an airstrike, this was a nightmare scenario. Every minute they spent searching for the enemy was a minute that consumed their precious fuel, reducing their chances of making it back to their carrier. McCluskey was faced with a terrible choice. The logical, prudent thing to do was to abandon the mission and return to the Enterprise. His planes were approaching the point of no return, but something in his gut, a pilot's instinct, told him to press on. He made a decision that defied the odds and the textbooks. He decided to continue his search. He knew the Japanese fleet had to be out there somewhere. He made an educated guess and turned his squadron to the northwest, a decision based on little more than a hunch. For another agonizing 15 minutes, they flew over an empty sea. The fuel gauges in his planes were dipping into the red. The moment was fast approaching when he would have to give the order to turn back, to admit failure. And then he saw it, a thin white wake on the blue ocean below. It was a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which had been left behind to chase an American submarine and was now steaming at high speed to rejoin its fleet. McCluskey made another snap decision. He would follow the destroyer. It was a gamble, but it was the only lead he had. His gamble paid off in the most spectacular way imaginable. The Arashi led him directly to the main body of the Japanese fleet. As McCluskey and his squadron broke through the clouds, they saw a sight that no American had yet seen and survived: the 4 great aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, their flight decks crowded with planes, vulnerable and completely unaware that death was diving on them from above. McCluskey had found them. At that exact moment, the Japanese combat air patrol was at sea level, distracted by the suicidal attacks of the American torpedo bombers. The skies above the carriers were wide open. It was a moment of perfect, miraculous, and deadly timing. McCluskey led the attack, his dive bombers plunging down, their bombs striking the Kaga and the Akagi. Almost simultaneously, the dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived and hit the Sōryū. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into blazing wrecks. McCluskey's gamble had changed the course of the war. The USS Yorktown was a ship that refused to die. Her story at the Battle of Midway is an epic of resilience, a testament to the incredible courage and skill of her crew. She was a ship that had already been to hell and back. Badly damaged just a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had limped into Pearl Harbor, where she was resurrected from a near wreck in an astonishing 72-hour feat of engineering and sheer willpower. She sailed to Midway as a symbol of American resolve, a wounded warrior returning to the fray. And in the battle to come, she would be tested as no other ship was. On the morning of June 4th, the Yorktown's planes played a crucial role in the initial devastating strike against the Japanese carriers. Her dive bombers, arriving over the enemy fleet at the same time as those from the Enterprise, helped to turn the tide of the battle in 5 fateful minutes, leaving the Japanese carrier Sōryū a burning inferno. But the Yorktown's triumph would be short-lived. The fourth and only surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryū, was still out there, and she was seeking revenge. At around noon, the first wave of Japanese dive bombers from the Hiryū found the Yorktown. Despite a ferocious anti-aircraft barrage from the ship and her escorts, the Japanese pilots pressed their attack with suicidal bravery. The Yorktown was hit by 3 bombs. One plunged down the smokestack, and 2 others tore through her flight deck, causing massive fires and knocking out her boilers. The ship lost power and went dead in the water, a sitting duck. But the crew of the Yorktown was one of the best in the Navy. Her damage control teams performed miracles. Led by the legendary Lieutenant Commander Joseph C. Clifton, they fought the fires, patched the holes below the waterline, and, in an incredible feat of engineering, had the boilers back online and the ship moving again in just over an hour. When the second Japanese attack wave, this time of torpedo bombers, arrived, they saw a ship that was underway and operating, and they assumed it must be a different, undamaged carrier. The second attack was just as fierce. The Yorktown was hit by 2 torpedoes that ripped open her port side, causing a severe list. Once again, the ship lost power. With the ship in danger of capsizing, the order was given to abandon ship. The wounded were lowered into life rafts, and the crew slid down ropes into the oily water. But even then, the Yorktown did not sink. The next day, a salvage team was put back on board, and they began the slow, arduous process of trying to save the crippled vessel. It seemed another miracle was in the making, but it was not to be. On June 6, the Japanese submarine 168 found the wounded carrier and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 of them struck the Yorktown, and another sank her escorting destroyer. On the morning of June 7th, the venerable USS Yorktown, the ship that had twice refused to die, finally gave up her fight and slipped beneath the waves. The Battle of Midway was, at its heart, a duel between aircraft carriers, and the most important weapon in that duel was the dive bomber. These were the planes that delivered the decisive blows, the surgical instruments that could place a 1,000-pound bomb directly onto the flight deck of a moving ship. The battle was a direct comparison of the 2 navies' premier dive bombers, the American Douglas SBD Dauntless and the Japanese Aichi D-3A, codenamed Val by the Allies. The Val was a formidable aircraft. It had been the star of the early war, playing a key role in the attack on Pearl Harbor and the sinking of British warships in the Indian Ocean. It was a light, agile, and highly maneuverable plane, with fixed landing gear that gave it a distinctive, predatory look. In the hands of the highly trained and experienced pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was an incredibly accurate and deadly weapon. The Val had a longer range than its American counterpart and was considered by many to be a superior aircraft in a dogfight. The SBD Dauntless, on the other hand, was a less glamorous but incredibly rugged and reliable aircraft. It was slower and less maneuverable than the Val, a fact that made it vulnerable to the fast-climbing Zero fighters. But it had several key advantages. It was built like a tank, capable of absorbing an enormous amount of punishment and still bringing its crew home. Its perforated dive brakes allowed it to make incredibly steep and stable bombing dives, which contributed to its legendary accuracy. Most importantly, the Dauntless was a forgiving plane to fly, a crucial factor for a navy that was rapidly expanding and training thousands of new, inexperienced pilots. The pilot and the rear gunner were also protected by armor plating, a feature that was often absent in the lighter Japanese designs. At Midway, the Dauntless proved to be the decisive weapon of the battle. While the vals of the Hiryū's counterattack scored 3 direct hits on the USS Yorktown, it was the Dauntlesses from the Enterprise, and the Yorktown that, in the space of 5 fateful minutes, hit and fatally damaged the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū. The battle was a testament to the Dauntless's ruggedness and the skill of the American pilots. They flew their missions without fighter cover, were harried by Zeros, and faced a storm of anti-aircraft fire, yet they pressed their attacks and delivered their bombs with devastating precision. The clash between the Dauntless and the Val at Midway was more than a technological showdown. It was a reflection of the two nations' differing philosophies of war. The Japanese Val was a finely crafted, high-performance weapon for an elite corps of pilots. The American Dauntless was a tough, reliable workhorse for a mass citizen navy. At Midway, the workhorse proved to be the war winner. The story of the American torpedo bombers at the Battle of Midway is a tale of incredible courage in the face of technological failure. The Douglas TBD Devastator, the U.S. Navy's standard torpedo bomber at the start of the war, was, by 1942, a flying coffin. It was a tragically flawed and obsolete aircraft, and to send men into battle in it against the modern defenses of the Japanese fleet was to send them to their deaths. Their sacrifice is one of the most heroic and heartbreaking chapters of the battle. The Devastator had been a revolutionary aircraft when it was introduced in the mid to 1930s, the first all-metal monoplane to serve with the U.S. Navy. But by the standards of World War II, it was hopelessly outclassed. It was incredibly slow, with a top speed of just over 200 miles per hour, making it an easy target for the fast and agile Japanese Zero fighters. It was also poorly armed for self-defense, with only a single forward-firing machine gun for the pilot and a single machine gun for the rear gunner. But the Devastator's greatest flaw was its primary weapon, the Mark 13 torpedo. The torpedo was a notoriously unreliable piece of equipment. It was slow, it had a tendency to run deeper than its set depth, and its contact exploder often failed to detonate even on a direct hit. To make matters worse, to launch the torpedo, the Devastator had to fly in a long, slow, straight line at a low altitude, making it a sitting duck for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The pilots and crews of the torpedo squadrons knew the deficiencies of their aircraft all too well. But on the morning of June 4th, they flew their missions with a courage that bordered on the suicidal. A total of 41 Devastators from the 3 American carriers took part in the attacks on the Japanese fleet. They were sent in without adequate fighter cover and were met by a swarm of Zero fighters. The result was a slaughter. Of the 41 Devastators that took part in the attacks, only 6 returned. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet was completely wiped out. In tactical terms, the attacks were a catastrophic failure. Not a single one of their torpedoes scored a hit on an enemy carrier, but in strategic terms, their sacrifice was not in vain. Their relentless, low-level attacks drew the Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies at high altitude unprotected, and they forced the Japanese carriers to engage in constant, violent, evasive maneuvers, which disrupted their ability to launch their own aircraft. The men of the torpedo squadrons were the sacrificial lambs of Midway, the men who died to create the opening that the dive bombers would so spectacularly exploit just minutes later. The air battles of Midway were a dramatic showdown between the 2 premier naval fighter aircraft of the early Pacific War, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 and the American Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was a classic contest of agility versus armor, a duel that had been playing out in the skies since Pearl Harbor, and that would reach its climax at Midway. The Zero was, at the time, arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It was a masterpiece of aeronautical design, a light, graceful, and incredibly agile aircraft. It could climb, turn, and range any of its allied counterparts. In the hands of the highly skilled and experienced pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it had seemed invincible in the first 6 months of the war, sweeping all opposition from the skies. But the Zero's incredible performance came at a price. To achieve its lightweight and agility, its designers had sacrificed armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. This made the Zero incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire. A few well-placed shots could easily turn the elegant fighter into a flaming wreck. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the Zero's opposite in almost every way. It was a rugged, heavily armored, and relatively slow aircraft. In a classic turning dogfight, it was no match for the nimble Zero. An American pilot who tried to out-turn a Zero was a dead man. But the Wildcat was built like a flying tank. It could absorb an enormous amount of punishment and still bring its pilot home. It also had superior firepower and could dive much faster than the lighter Zero. American pilots quickly learned that while they could not win a turning fight, they could win a diving one. The key to surviving and fighting against the Zero was to avoid its strengths and to exploit its weaknesses. American naval aviator Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thack developed a revolutionary tactic that allowed the slower Wildcats to effectively counter the more maneuverable Zeros. This was the Thack weave. The tactic involved two or more friendly fighters flying in formation. When a Zero would get on the tail of one Wildcat, its wingman would turn toward it. This would force the Zero to either abandon its attack or to expose its own tail to the guns of the second Wildcat. The Thack weave was a brilliant solution to a difficult tactical problem, a way to use teamwork and mutual support to overcome a technologically superior enemy. At Midway, the Wildcat pilots, using these new tactics, were able to hold their own against the Zeros of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. They were unable to prevent the slaughter of the Devastator torpedo bombers, but they were able to disrupt the Japanese fighter screen and to protect their own dive bombers during their crucial attacks. The duel between the Zero and the Wildcat at Midway was a pivotal moment in the air war, a battle that demonstrated that superior technology could be countered by superior tactics and rugged determination. The Battle of Midway was won not just by brave pilots and rugged aircraft, but by a less visible but equally crucial weapon, intelligence. The battle was a dramatic demonstration of the new and powerful role that radio interception, code-breaking and aerial reconnaissance would play in modern naval warfare. It was a battle where seeing the enemy, or in this case, hearing the enemy, before they could see you, was the key to victory. The American victory was, at its heart, an intelligence victory. The brilliant and tireless work of the codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had given Admiral Nimitz the single most important advantage in the battle: foreknowledge. He knew where and when the Japanese were going to attack. This allowed him to discount the Japanese diversionary attack in the Aleutians and to concentrate his limited forces at the decisive point, setting a perfect ambush for the unsuspecting Japanese fleet. The Japanese, on the other hand, were operating in a state of self-imposed blindness. They were overconfident in the security of their naval codes and were unaware that the Americans were reading their mail. Their own intelligence, gathering efforts before the battle, were a series of failures. Their plan to use a line of submarines to detect the American carriers as they left Pearl Harbor failed, as the submarines arrived on station too late. The battle itself was a stark illustration of the importance of real-to-time reconnaissance. On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese launched a large and complex search pattern with their scout planes to locate the American fleet. But the search was poorly managed and had several crucial gaps. One of the scout planes, delayed by a catapult malfunction, was the one assigned to the sector where the American carriers were actually located. This delay was a small accident, but it had catastrophic consequences. By the time the Japanese scout plane did finally spot the American fleet, it was too late. The American dive bombers were already on their way. The American reconnaissance effort, though also hampered by bad luck, was ultimately more successful. It was a PBY Catalina flying boat, based on Midway Island, that first spotted the approaching Japanese invasion force on June 3rd. And it was another Catalina that spotted the main Japanese carrier force on the morning of the battle. This information, relayed back to the American carriers, was crucial for launching their own strikes. The Battle of Midway was a powerful lesson in the new realities of carrier warfare. It was a battle fought over vast distances, by forces that would never see each other. In this new kind of war, the eyes of the fleet were no longer the lookouts in the crow's nest, but the codebreakers in their windowless rooms and the long-range patrol planes scanning the empty ocean. At Midway, the Americans simply saw their enemy better, and that made all the difference. For the United States, the victory at Midway was immediate, public, and transformative. It was a miracle, a stunning and much-needed victory that lifted the spirits of a nation. But for Japan, the Battle of Midway was a secret, a catastrophic defeat that was deliberately and systematically hidden from the Japanese people and even from much of its own military. The effort to conceal the truth was a testament to the rigid control that the military government held over Japanese society and the profound sense of shame that accompanied the defeat. The scale of the loss was simply too devastating to be admitted. To lose 4 of the Navy's finest aircraft carriers, the very ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, and to lose hundreds of its most experienced and irreplaceable pilots, was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. To admit such a defeat would be to shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility, a myth that was a central pillar of the nation's war effort. So, the government lied. The survivors of the battle, the men who had been pulled from the oily, burning waters, were the first to be silenced. They were not greeted as heroes who had fought bravely, but as the embarrassing witnesses to a disaster. They were brought back to Japan, isolated in special naval hospitals, and forbidden from contacting their families or speaking to anyone about what had happened. They were effectively quarantined to prevent the truth from spreading. The official announcements about the battle were masterpieces of deception. The Japanese press reported a great victory, claiming that 2 American carriers had been sunk and that Midway had been heavily damaged. The loss of their own carriers was either not mentioned at all or was downplayed as the loss of a single, smaller carrier. The Japanese people were fed a steady diet of propaganda that painted a picture of an unbroken string of glorious victories. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Within the highest echelons of the Navy, the reality of the defeat was known, and it was a source of profound shock and recrimination. The loss of the carriers and the veteran pilots was a strategic catastrophe that fundamentally altered the course of the war. But even here, the full story was often suppressed, as different factions sought to avoid blame. The hidden defeat at Midway created a strange and dangerous disconnect between the reality of Japan's military situation and the public's perception of it, a disconnect that would make it even more difficult for the nation to confront the reality of its eventual, total defeat. The victory at Midway was not an end, but a beginning. It was the moment the strategic initiative in the Pacific shifted from Japan to the United States. Midway had blunted the Japanese offensive. Now, it was America's turn to attack. And the first major American offensive of the Pacific War would take place just 2 months later, on a remote, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands that few Americans had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal campaign would have been impossible without the victory at Midway. Midway had crippled the Japanese carrier fleet, giving the U.S. Navy a temporary naval superiority that it could use to project its power. The American High Command decided to use this window of opportunity to seize the offensive and to stop the Japanese advance in the South Pacific, where they were building an airfield on Guadalcanal that threatened the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia. On August 7, 1942, the 1 Stone Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, surprising the Japanese and easily capturing the nearly completed airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field. But the easy part was over. The Japanese, realizing the strategic importance of the island, were determined to take it back. What followed was a brutal 6-month-long campaign of attrition, a savage struggle fought on land, at sea, and in the air. The fighting on Guadalcanal was some of the most ferocious of the entire war. The Marines and later, the U.S. Army soldiers fought in a hellish jungle environment of suffocating heat, torrential rain, and tropical diseases like malaria. They faced a determined and fanatical enemy who fought with a suicidal bravery, launching a series of bloody nighttime banzai charges against the American perimeter around Henderson Field. The battle for control of the airfield was the heart of the campaign. Henderson Field was the Americans' lifeline. By day, its planes, the Cactus Air Force, controlled the skies, but at night, the Japanese Navy, the Tokyo Express, would steam down the slot to shell the airfield and to land reinforcements. A series of brutal and desperate naval battles were fought in the waters around Guadalcanal, including the savage night actions at Savo Island and Cape Esperance. Both sides suffered heavy losses. In the end, it was a battle of logistics, a race to see who could reinforce and resupply their troops on the island faster. And this was a race the United States, with its superior industrial capacity, was destined to win. By February 1943, the Japanese, having suffered horrific casualties and unable to dislodge the Americans, evacuated their remaining troops from the island. The Guadalcanal campaign was a brutal and costly victory for the United States, but it was a decisive one. It stopped the Japanese advance in the South Pacific, secured the supply lines to Australia, and marked the beginning of the long island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead to the shores of Japan. It was the first step on the long road to Tokyo, a step that was only made possible by the miracle at Midway. While the great carrier battles like Midway captured the headlines and the public's imagination, another, quieter and equally decisive war was being waged in the depths of the Pacific Ocean. This was the American submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping, a relentless and systematic war of attrition that would ultimately cripple Japan's war economy and bring the island nation to the brink of starvation. And this silent, deadly campaign was made possible by the victory at Midway. At the start of the war, Japan was a major industrial power, but it was an empire with a fatal vulnerability. It was almost completely dependent on imported raw materials, oil, iron ore, rubber, and food. All of it had to be brought to the home islands by a vast fleet of merchant ships. This merchant marine was the lifeblood of Japan's war effort. The American naval strategists knew that if they could sever this lifeline, they could strangle Japan into submission. In the first months of the war, the American submarine force was largely ineffective. Their torpedoes, like those of their aviation counterparts, were plagued by technical problems, often failing to explode even on a direct hit. But by mid-1942, after the victory at Midway had given the U.S. Navy a new confidence and a more aggressive posture, the submarine campaign began to come into its own. New, more reliable torpedoes were introduced, and the submarine commanders, the Silent Service, were given the green light to wage an unrestricted campaign against all Japanese shipping. The American submarines, long-range fleet boats like the Gato and Balao classes, began to prowl the shipping lanes of the Pacific, sinking merchant ships with a deadly efficiency. They operated alone, far from home, in a dangerous and lonely war of ambush and evasion. The life of a submariner was a tense, claustrophobic existence, a world of sonar pings, sudden depth charge attacks, and the constant fear of a watery grave. But their results were devastating. By the end of the war, the U.S. submarine force had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, over half of their entire merchant fleet. They had also sunk over 200 warships, including an aircraft carrier and several battleships. This relentless campaign had a catastrophic effect on the Japanese economy. The flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies was cut to a trickle, grounding Japan's remaining navy and air force. The importation of food was so severely curtailed that by 1945, the civilian population was facing mass starvation. The Silent Service had choked the life out of Japan's war machine, a decisive but often overlooked contribution to the Allied victory and a campaign that was only made possible by the new naval realities created at the Battle of Midway. A year after the Battle of Midway, the American codebreakers who had given Admiral Nimitz his decisive edge were still hard at work, listening to the secrets of the Japanese Navy. And in April 1943, they intercepted a series of messages that provided them with an opportunity of almost unbelievable significance. They had deciphered the detailed flight itinerary of a man who was not just a military commander, but a national icon, the architect of Japan's entire war strategy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The messages revealed that Yamamoto was planning an inspection tour of the Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. He would be flying in a transport bomber with a small fighter escort on a precise route at a precise time. For the Americans, this was a chance to decapitate the Japanese military leadership, to kill the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The decision of whether or not to act on this intelligence went all the way to the top. There were moral and practical considerations. To deliberately target and assassinate a specific enemy commander was a controversial step. But the war in the Pacific was a brutal affair, and Yamamoto was not just any commander, he was the symbol of Japan's military prowess. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself approved the mission, which was given the code name Operation Vengeance. The challenge was immense. Yamamoto's flight would be at the extreme range of any American fighter aircraft. The mission would require perfect timing, perfect navigation, and a great deal of luck. The task was given to a squadron of U.S. Army Air Force's P-38 Lightning fighters based on Guadalcanal. The P-38 was the only American fighter with the range to make the long overwater flight to intercept Yamamoto. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 seconds took off from Henderson Field. They flew for over 2 hours at extremely low altitude to avoid Japanese radar, navigating by compass over a trackless ocean. In a remarkable feat of aerial navigation, they arrived at the predicted intercept point at the exact moment that Yamamoto's 2 transport bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, appeared in the sky. A swirling dogfight ensued. The P-38 seconds, with their superior speed and firepower, shot down both of the Japanese bombers and several of the escorting Zeros. Admiral Yamamoto was killed when his plane crashed into the jungle of Bougainville Island. The mission was a stunning success, a perfect execution of an intelligence-driven ambush. The death of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and a significant loss for their military leadership. And it was a victory that was a direct and powerful echo of the battle that had sealed his fate a year earlier. The same brilliant codebreakers who had uncovered his plans for Midway had now led his enemies directly to him, a final, fatal testament to the power of the silent war of intelligence. The Battle of Midway was the death knell of an entire era of naval warfare. For centuries, the battleship, with its massive guns and thick armor, had been the undisputed queen of the seas. A nation's power was measured by the number of battleships in its fleet. But in the space of a few hours on June 4, 1942, that entire paradigm was rendered obsolete. Midway proved, in the most dramatic and brutal way imaginable, that a new monarch now ruled the waves, the aircraft carrier. The battle was the first major naval engagement in history in which the opposing surface fleets never saw or fired upon each other. It was a battle fought entirely by aircraft, launched from floating airfields that could project power over hundreds of miles. The battleship, for all its majesty, was now just a vulnerable, slow-moving target for the new masters of the sea, the dive bombers and torpedo planes of the carrier air groups. At Midway, the Japanese had brought their super battleship, the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship in the world. But it never fired its massive 18-inch guns in anger. It could only watch helplessly from a distance as its protecting screen of aircraft carriers was sent to the bottom by a handful of American planes. Midway cemented the aircraft carrier as the new capital ship, the centerpiece of the modern Navy. The lesson was clear. Control of the sea now depended on control of the air. The nation that could project its air power most effectively from the decks of its carriers would dominate the oceans. This realization fundamentally reshaped naval doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The United States, with its immense industrial capacity, was uniquely positioned to capitalize on this new reality. In the years after Midway, American shipyards began to produce a new generation of fast, powerful Essex-class carriers at an astonishing rate. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy would have a fleet of over 100 carriers of various sizes, a force that would give it an unchallengeable naval supremacy. The Japanese, on the other hand, could not recover from the loss of their 4 best carriers and their experienced pilots at Midway. They could not replace them fast enough. The battle had not just sunk 4 ships, it had broken the back of their naval air power. The legacy of Midway is therefore more than just the story of a single decisive battle. It is the story of a technological and strategic revolution. It was the moment the torch of naval supremacy was passed from the battleship to the aircraft carrier, a shift that has defined the nature of sea power to this very day. The roar of the engines has long since faded. The smoke has cleared. The waves of the Pacific wash over the wrecks of sunken warships, silent tombs that hold the stories of a battle that changed the world. For the men who survived the inferno of Midway, the battle never truly ended. It lived on in their memories, in their nightmares, in the quiet, unspoken bond of those who had faced the abyss together. Their stories are the final, human echo of this epic conflict, Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, became an instant national hero. He spent the rest of his life recounting his incredible story, a living testament to the sacrifice of his comrades. But he also carried the heavy burden of the survivor, the haunting question of why he had been spared when so many others had not. Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber leader whose gut decision to press his search had led him to the Japanese fleet, was awarded the Navy Cross for his heroism. But his career after the war was a quiet one. Like many of the battle's heroes, he did not seek the spotlight, content to have done his duty in a moment when his nation needed him most. The men of the damage control teams on the USS Yorktown, who fought with such incredible bravery to keep their ship alive, returned to a navy that had learned profound lessons from their experience. Their innovations in firefighting and damage control became standard practice, saving countless lives in the battles to come. And what of the Codebreakers of Station Hypo? Their victory was so secret that they could not even celebrate it. Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant but abrasive commander who had cracked the Japanese code, was denied official recognition for his contribution for decades, a victim of internal Navy politics. It was not until years later, long after his death, that he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. His story is a poignant reminder that the greatest contributions to victory are not always made on the battlefield. The Battle of Midway was a miracle, a victory against impossible odds, a turning point in the war. But it was a miracle that was paid for in blood, courage, and sacrifice. The final echo of the battle is not in the grand sweep of history, but in the individual human stories of the men who fought it. It is in the memory of the young pilots who flew into a storm of fire, of the sailors who fought to save their sinking ships, of the codebreakers who worked in secret to give their nation a fighting chance. It is in their quiet courage that the true meaning of Midway can be found.